Ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight of speaking with David McKerracher. Oh my goodness, thank you for being here. Theory Underground's wonderful. They were at the house, and we had so much fun. The kids had a blast. We talked for many hours. It was completely delightful. It felt just like that. Theory Underground has
For
been
days and days and days
just
on
days,
end. It was
days.
nonstop.
Actually, this is virtual reality. We're actually still there in the Agaraja. So it's complete blast. I really appreciate the work. I think I really appreciate the on the ground work because that's extremely difficult and extremely important. I very much appreciate the aura, atmosphere, way of being they brought into our home and that they've always brought into conversations. And I always appreciate the laser focus on ultimately getting at what, well, Michelle and I think matters. How do you live? Children, family, thinking, yes, capital, but also being realistic. Also thinking about strains of money, homeschooling, schooling, education, the breakdown of any sort of shared canon by which to communicate, having kind of fragmented attention and somehow having to maintain the good life. And what does that mean? And what do you do about it if lots of people disagree about it? And what if the conditions of possibility aren't there to even think it or to do it? And yet, nevertheless, one needs to try because it seems problematic if one simply gives up on the good life. Yes, that seems to be a defeat. But you will not see such a defeat at Theory Underground. And that is something Michelle and I greatly appreciate. So, Dave, I've been very interested in all the work you've been doing because it is focused. We love socioanalysis. We think the thinkers that are in that field are necessary for the conversation. They get missed. But I know something else we've talked about involving homeschooling. What does that look like? I know that's something you're interested in and been thinking about. Michelle and I think about it a lot. Also, on the idea that there's not a shared canon anymore. People don't share the same texts. They don't watch the same TV shows. They don't have the same kind of cultural artifacts at hand by which to refer to. And so there can be a certain breaking up of people, a lack of means to draw and to communicate. That could be very problematic. And also, too, another thing that has come up that we might touch on at some point, at any point, just kind of asynchronous time, I think is very interesting. The different relations with time, how most of us exist in a media environment of now this, now this, now this, now this, that kind of breaks up attention. And what does it look like not to give into that? Not to have our way of thinking completely owned by that and broken up by that. And indeed, all of this, I think, is part of the question of what it means to live the good life. And having that question, I think, be at the at the center of our thought and seeing that as something we're constantly orbiting and thinking about, but not in a simplistic way, not in a way that ignores the material condition, that ignores the medium, that ignores lacks of time energy, I think is real work. And I appreciate that being work that you do. And so, David, any of that you'd like to speak on or anything on general, I'm down because a conversation with you is always a good time.
Wonderful. Well, it's so great to be here, Daniel. I did not realize we were going to have an intellectual conversation. I thought it was just going to be a dance party. And so I had to get ready for it. So I ate a whole pizza and then I took a nap here on the floor in this office. You can't
Just,
actually see it, but this is the office space at the sociology department at Boise State University.
just,
And right when I was starting to fall asleep, right as I was there's those moments where it's like you're having like a really dumb sort of daydream right before you fall asleep, and I was like, wait a minute, this is a stupid dream. I could just like go past it and probably fall asleep. And I was at that moment where I was sinking past, and but right then I could hear the administrative assistant who is leaving her job after like 15 years here. She comes walking down the hall. She's talking to somebody, and I was just like, oh gosh, I hope they don't come in. And she goes, and right here's another one of the offices. And the door opens and the light comes on. And I looked up and I said, and they both go, they both went, "Ah!" They go, "Ah!" And oh, I'm sorry. I'm just taking a nap before a meeting in 20 minutes. And they were like, oh, that's okay. And then they shut it all back
just
down
got it.
and left me alone after that. So you know, I thought I would do it in here because I am officially moved out of the apartment that I've been living in for the last year and a half with Anne. And we are moving up to North Idaho from South Idaho, which is for Europeans about as far away as some countries from one another. But it's actually like a 7-hour drive. And so, yeah, I think you get to Germany and to Britain and back, in that amount of time. I'm not sure, but uh, yeah, without having my own office space, I was like, oh, I might as well use that adjunct office space that they gave me, which is actually not mine because I share it with seven other people because that's the state of the university today. This is a closet. I might as well actually just turn on the background here so I can actually show it off
And see the
because,
closet.
this is for history. This is not something that will ever happen again. My children in the future will be like, oh, Dad, why didn't you show the room? We'll never get to see you in a real university. I'll be like, that's right. You'll never see me in that place ever again. But here it is.
There it is.
This is the place. Yeah, look at this.
It is.
Look at this dismal room. Um, so yeah,
I imagine seven people stuffed into there, all around that desk, and they're like putting their arms like this.
yeah, yeah. Well, there's taking turns hypothetically, but the fact is nobody uses it because it doesn't even have windows. Um, or ventilation, not really. And so,
Don't prisons have
you know,
windows?
even prisons have windows. That's true. So I'm waking up and getting oriented again. And I'm thinking about all the stuff you just kind of spread across there. And it's like there's a buffet of items that we can zoom in on and talk about. And the canon one in particular is one that I'll want to come back to because it's directly related to the post-class fractured mass, the PCFM, which is a way of talking about something that I've been trying to wrap my head around and articulate for a long time, which is itself just one of many things that we are getting at or trying to wrap our heads around in an attempt to, the way I like to say it is, understand the situation. What is our situation today? A lot of people want to run forward and diagnose things without having spent any serious time. Sorry, people want to run around and offer up prescriptions without having spent any time thinking about, well, what is the diagnosis? And so when people say it's capitalism or capital, for instance, of course, what they're doing is they're saying the diagnosis is basically what it was in the time of Charles Dickens. Usually they'll say it's just intensified. But in a lot of ways, a lot of those things that they thought were intensified are not intensifying, right? So the idea that it was plausible at one point in time to think that there were two classes becoming the only two real contending classes out of the entirety of a class society, that being the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Never mind the peasantry, never mind the middle class, never mind the old aristocracy, never mind. No, all of these other things don't matter. It's going to be the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. That's the only real contradiction, and they will grow and grow and grow in size. And it's funny to go back to the manifesto for the Communist Party written by Engels and Marx and to think about how, what totally made sense then is still being put forward by people as though nothing has really changed. And so I think we have to reassess the situation. And just, for people so that they know, I'm actually coming from a principled and attempting a rigorous analysis and critique here. I would just list off a handful of factors quickly before moving on, and that would be to say that the proletariat is not the working class. People who use those terms interchangeably do so because it's convenient for them rhetorically, but it will be increasingly inconvenient as the PCFM thesis spreads because the proletariat is an industrial army. It is militarized. It is disciplined. It is concentrated in the hearts of both cities and factories. And it's a class that is not just in itself, but easily for itself. In fact, it was self-organizing because of its shared basis in both immiseration, but also ability to have a sort of power over the situation, right? When your hands are on the levers of the means of production and you are simultaneously, easily replaced by other people, and there's a line of people out the door wanting your job, and the machines have made the labor easy enough that people are indeed able to replace you. A certain kind of class consciousness is not something that you have to go out there and try to inculcate. It's something that's already happening, right? It's this is the natural state of the worker in those proletarian conditions is this sort of union consciousness, and that's something Marx was aware of. It's something Lenin was aware of, and their whole thing was like, well, we have to take it beyond that, though. There's this giant movement of proletarians. It's only going to grow and grow and grow, and if we can just give them a little direction to see a way beyond capitalism, well, then wouldn't that be great? We could have a classless society eventually. And I was very taken by some of that idea at some point, right? Enough so that I would have called myself a Marxist at some point in my development. And now I'm not. And so trying to square why I'm not, well, there's a lot of things, but just take some of the stuff that I already listed off. The geographical concentration of the proletariat is no more. It's been dispersed across the globe. The seeing one another's immiserated status and being able to understand, oh, we're all in this together, that is no more. The kind of military discipline that they had also is no more. Advanced workers are something I left out earlier, which I have to bring in at this point because this is the bridge to talking about the professionals and managers, and or we could say the managerial revolution. There was, or there used to be, this thing called advanced workers in factories. So among the proletariat, there were those who had built the forms of cultural and social capital, as we could say, but really we could also just call that trust among their peers and the rank and file, as well as experience spent doing everything. When you have advanced workers who know everybody and know how to do everything, obviously bosses and managers are redundant or easy to get rid of, or you can just step up and say, hey, we don't need you guys anymore. Okay, we're going to take over this factory. That's obviously gone. That's obviously gone, and it's been replaced by people with diplomas, degrees, usually, degree havers. That's not an accident. It's a part of an intentional project, to, as Barbara and John Ehrenreich say in their seminal The Professional Managerial Class Piece, they say it's cheaper to hire college degree having professionals to replace the advanced workers than it is to pay Pinkertons to come up and beat the living crap out of those striking workers, right? Because when you oppress people directly, it sparks rebellion. So, you're like, oh, look, a fire. Let's throw some gasoline on it. Oh, that's not working. Let's send in some nerdy looking guys who sit at the front of class and became hall monitors. And they have learned very little beyond discipline and how to take orders and respect the arbitrary interests and deadlines of their betters. Okay. So all of that being said, I'm not even like at this point fully on board with the left as a working class movement. I'm not even sure that it makes sense anymore. I'm not sure that the revolutionary subject of the old or new left is the way forward. And so what I did at the Platypus Convention in Chicago a few weeks ago was I took on the old and new left revolutionary subjects. And I maintain that the fundamental distinction between old and new left is the conception of that revolutionary subject. So whether you're an anarchist or a Marxist, the old left believed that the revolutionary subject was the working class, or a segment of the working class, if you were to go with Marx and Engels, who thought it would be the proletariat. And if you are of the new left, then it's really the Black, the Vietnamese, the youth culture, take out or women, you take any of these existing struggles that seems popular on college campuses, and then you go, okay, yeah, let's just bundle them all together. And my point from there was that this is a sort of reverse fascism. Instead of taking all of the tried and true traditional things that work and bundling them together, the winners of history, you instead bundle together a bunch of the losers of history, and you say, aha, see, that'll work. And of course, that doesn't work for much more than gaming the sympathies of some Hillary supporters to, fund your nonprofit. So, I mean, up to a certain point, it might have made sense up until those civil rights struggles were integrated or assimilated into the existing institutions. which happened a long time ago. And of course, it's easy to critique the new left from this old left standpoint, but what's a different standpoint to take up? Should it be something that's more conservative? Should it be something that's more right wing? Should it be perhaps libertarian? What about, a sort of neoliberal Austrian approach? And of course, I think that there's a baby in every one of these bathwaters. Every single one of the ways that people have viewed the world in a sort of committed or principled uh, uh, manner, there's always going to be something that they're able to see that other people aren't able to see. But whether we're talking about reform or revolution, whether we're talking about from above or from below, I think that we have to have spaces to think and question and work through these things. And that every time I try to set up a space to think and question and work through these things so that we can try to understand the situation, there are people who want to reform or revolutionize, who want to rush in and be like, oh, that's enough. We just need to get after it. We just need to change the world. And it's like, I think it is changing the world just to have educational spaces, genuine educational spaces that are outside of schooling facilities. First of all, that is a thing. Second of all, it's empowering. But third of all, it's not trustworthy if it has an explicit political agenda. Most people don't trust like that. Not that I think that what most people do or do not believe or trust should be the thing that we go with, but in this case, I think so. I think that it's right to scorn the idea that genuine education takes place in spaces that are tailor made to get you to buy into a whole set of conclusions, as opposed to dig into subject matters opened up by fundamental questions. So that's a lot. I'll just hand it back over to you for now.
I think the question on what is the revolutionary subject and is it even problematic to ask that question, because then you're going to be looking for it, is actually extremely important. I think the idea that what the proletariat refers to when Marx is writing being a condition that is no longer the case is true and very important. And failure to realize that leads to a lot of, in my opinion, efforts that are destined to fail because they're ultimately just going to be a repetition of a previous logic that leads to the same outcome. So I appreciate all of that. A few things that come to mind. As you were talking about the proletariat, it actually made me think, as a slightly unrelated, but also I think similar problem when people look at, say, the Second Amendment in America. Well, one of the idea of Americans there being the right to bear arms for a well-armed militia is precisely because of the problem that if the government has a standing army, it taxes and it's very powerful, and therefore the people no longer have power because it is centralized, right? So a way you overcome that is by giving people the weapons, and then you bring them together, and you don't have to have a standing army, but you would still have an army, right? And that's how you get this tension between having self-defense, but also not overly central power, right? Well, of course, this no longer applies because the average citizen doesn't have drones or, military drones or different things. So that
Right.
function of the Second Amendment to help avoid the need of a government to have a standing army by taxing is no longer there. And so now you have that sort of notion of what the Second Amendment was there for is no longer the same. And it doesn't have the same function that it did. Then rather one thinks, that whole debate in a way, the debate is not even the same debate anymore because the reason they're even thinking of it back there is the problem of standing army and centralized power, right? So a lot of the debate now that's actually happening in, say, more often conservative circles over gun rights is almost entirely unrelated to the debate and the whole reason of the thinking back then, right? I think
Right.
similar happens on the left with the proletariat and the working class. The entire
100%.
debate about the working class now is not even it's not even the same condition. It's not even what you're like you're saying. The proletariat is this military discipline. There are certain conditions that are not the same, and that has to be taken very, very seriously. Now, at the same time, I understand the idea where you're going, okay, guys, but what else is so central to the functioning of a social order like work that the people could take claim to and lead to true revolutionary potential, right? Because that's
100%.
there's almost for me very often when I hear people on the left talking about the need to think, to kind of reify a classic understanding of the working class, it's almost like but what else can we do? Because has that what else can the average person potentially offer those in power that those in power need other than labor that has some sort of potential of the people to take back and actually have real leverage then against the powerful, right? And if you, and there can, I think, perhaps be a certain feeling where if you're suggesting that that possibility is no longer there, then isn't it over? Aren't we doomed? Is almost what I think is going on. Well, I think often real, as Cadell and I will, talk about, it's really thinking the limit or thinking where you think you're doomed that thinking begins, right? It's actually saying, no, let's actually think if the conditions for the proletariat is no longer there. What now? Let's actually take that seriously. That point of, as Fontaine, like Benjamin Fontaine is a favorite of mine, and he says thinking begins when you think the impossible, right? It's the impossible matters that actually generates a lot of the most fruitful thought. And also it tends to generate creative thought that tends to erupt out of the effort of thought that wouldn't build enough tension to so erupt if you weren't trying to think the impossible. Fontaine and his mentor, Levi Seston, says humans need the impossible. And actually, they argued, funny enough, that if we don't try to think the quote unquote impossible, that we're going to either end up in a totalitarianism, a certain regression, because you're going to be set in the horizons of thinking that have been set by the past, that are set by the powerful, and you're actually just going to end up in a place you don't want to go, even as you think you're advancing. I think also when you're talking about like the managerial class, it does make et cetera, so forth, the professional managerial class. I think there has generally been a movement, and I have in mind the great Matthew Stanley's work on Christian freedom. The Indo's book Silence is a wonderful book. And Matthew Stanley, thinking this tremendous novel in light of Zizek's work in psychoanalysis, et cetera, so forth, talks about, in Foucault, talks about a movement from force to power, we could put it, where if I use force to oppress you, then it's very obvious that I'm the bad guy, that I'm oppressing you, and that, there's a target, right? And so gradually there's been a movement from force to power, where instead what I do is get you to internalize your entrapment, internalize your impression, if you will, and you by your own reasoning and your own logic will actually end up where I want you to go, if you will, right? It makes me think of, I often with Pave like to talk about between Orwell and Huxley, Kafka, because I think Kafka is actually how the world is, and that's where people end up oppressed by power, not by force or pleasure, really. It's by Joseph K, by his own logic and his own understanding of the situation, walks into and feeds himself into the situation that ultimately leads to his death. Spoiler for classic literature. I'm terribly sorry. Joseph K dies at the end of the trial. I'm a monster. That's really, really important where the guard.
People need to know if you wait too long, eventually
it comes
you'll
out.
Find out. Yeah, eventually it will come out. So
eventually,
just get after it, folks. You better go read all the classics.
Right now. Eventually, some a-hole is going to have the cover of their YouTube video be the key moment in the series you're watching, and now it's too late because you can't unsee what you've seen. Major problem. There needs to pass a law. But in Kafka, it's like that's why at the end the guards turn the knife toward Joseph K to give him the handle to stab himself, because they're like, well, you've been doing this, and then they take it back and doing it. But it's like, well, this is your thing. You've done this. And I think we can read Kafka as stories of people under power versus force. And of course, Kafka is a lawyer and bureaucracy in the middle of all of this Kafka-esque sort of ways of life is really aware of this. And you see, the reason why I think this is important is because if you have moved from force to power, then the revolutionary subject that is still mostly thinking in terms of force, or a revolution of force, or a potential of using force on force, is ultimately actually going to be missing the mark, really. And I like a working class revolution, as opposed that I think, yes, very often people imagine that as people on the streets protesting, sort of kind of coming out and using more of a show of force or a show of solidarity in different things, right? But here's the issue. If really the problem is some sort of internalization of a way of thinking or a directionality, that because it so traps you, you can't even think your own entrapment, then actually shows a force, even if it is by supposedly force against the state, is actually operating according to the wrong logic. The logic that is not actually defining what is leading to people's entrapment, if you will. So the revolutionary subject has to be thinking power. Now, again, many people on the left will then get into Adorno and they'll talk the Frankfurt School and this idea of the psychology, what has happened to people, et cetera, so forth, right? That often gets into ideology and the idea that there's a certain ideology that has trapped us in different things. There certainly can be truth to this, but power does not simply operate in terms of worldview. It operates in terms of what you think your neighbors think is a good weekend, what you think is a good use of free time, what you think is responsible to do for your family, what habits you have, the ways that you go about carrying a conversation. You see, if you say, okay, if the problem is ideology, and of course, there are problems of ideology, no one is saying otherwise, it is a layer that has to be taken seriously. But if you critique ideology to show points of incompleteness or ways of enjoyment that one can get from the ideology, or ways that you can turn your suffering at work into something that gives you an identity, and so you're okay with that suffering, even if these sort of mental gymnastics that we play with ourselves to be the kind of subjects that then continue to follow the logic of capital. Well, if we point all of that out, but then don't move to the place of how people engage in conversation itself, or how they think about the books that they're reading, or the difference between, like, something Michelle and I talk about a lot, and I'll give it back to you in a moment. We talk about the difference between people who are always doing something. They always have something to get to. They have to fill their schedule constantly, right? And if you don't fill your schedule constantly, then you're, wasting your potential. You're not really doing everything you could do, versus someone who is actually going to be perhaps more dwelling in a sense, or creating that space to actually think, right? The tension, there's a kind of sometimes moralization between action or just kind of doing versus dwelling, if you grant me that distinction right there, right? Well, if actually a lot of the entrapment that results from power can only be addressed by dwelling, then perhaps you're engaging in a whole lot of busyness and action to ideology critique or to deal with ideology, and that will look like you're liberating people from power. But then if you turn around and that very, very busyness is actually removing you from the ability to change the conditions of possibility that you have internalized to change yourself as a subject, it will seem as if you're doing something revolutionary, but actually you're just going in a circle. Because I love the word revolution, because it brings with it a certain warning. The word revolution also means going in a circle, which means you go nowhere, right? Every idea of the revolutionary circle runs the risk of just going in a circle. Every idea of the revolutionary subject runs the risk of just going into a circle. And in my opinion, basically an emphasis on doing, on like, this is what we need to do to change the world in a preset idea, which is setting the thing external of you and you go to, is often going to be actually just the revolution that goes in a circle and is actually not really changing the power dynamics that you've internalized. It's just another manifestation of it, right? To actually have a revolutionary subject that would be sublative, or sort of actually kind of being able to think according to a different horizon versus that which you've absorbed from the zeitgeist, is going to require a lot more patience of the concept. It is going to require a much more dwelling, and actually just paying attention to the things that you do in the home, the way that you think about structuring your day and the kind of conversations you have with your kids. Because if the logic by which you do those things don't change, if you are still actually using a logic or a certain mode in the way that you talk with your children, or you talk with your wife, or how you live in your home, or the way that you think about work or food or all of these different things, if all of these are actually still according to a certain way of doing them, or a certain assumption of how they should be done, then you might be critiquing ideology all day. But the change has to start in the home. The change has to start in the home. And if it doesn't start in the home, then the critiques of ideology ultimately may just make, well, the zeitgeist or capital, whatever you want to call it, stronger. Because as it looks like a corrective mechanism is at play. It isn't. But since it looks like there's one at play, then there can be reason for people to continue doing it or trying it or latching their identity to it or playing it up. And all that actually will be doing is putting off the inevitable day when it is realized that this is not enough. Because if you don't change the habits of the home, then you certainly can't change the habits of the society. So I think what you are speaking of, these are the kind of thoughts that we need to think, in my opinion, that perhaps we will not think if we are thinking about a proletariat that was bound to a particular historical moment, but doesn't apply so much today. But that doesn't mean hope is lost. That just means we have to think differently about the hope we seek.
Not only is hope not lost, thank you, first of all, fantastic. Not only is hope not lost, I've found more hope, right? I found more hope, realizing that I had bought into a kind of all or nothing perfectionism from a bygone era that necessarily led to burnout and to a kind of pessimism. Well, on the other side of that, it's nothing but like hope and excitement, because it's like, well, if that's not the case anymore, if the diagnosis was wrong and therefore the cure was bogus, well, that just means that there could be all kinds of other things, you know. I mean, in fact, the way that I'm thinking about it, there could be solutions that are not not intelligible or understandable given our current categories of thinking, not given our current practices. There could be solutions that are not what we would currently think of as religious or political, or there could be insights into the human that are not encompassed by those domains or by sociology, anthropology, history, economics, philosophy. That every one of these comes from a time when somebody was trying to think something through, and the other resources available weren't going to cut it, right? Or you could say that there are little elements of every one of those in a past society, but we mainly blow those out of proportion now because we have these categories and then we look back and interpret history this retroactive way. In reality, there's a lot of people who've lived who never thought of themselves as religion, and they never knew of religion as a thing. Same as politics. They didn't think of that. That was not a thing. They did not think of politics, much less political philosophy, theory, or science. And so there, it's the possibility of organizing ourselves in new ways, right? In ways that are not technological, political, or economic solutions, but are other kinds of solutions, and that just have not been discovered. If we're not open to that, while nonetheless continuing to try things, well, then we're never going to come up with anything new, right? We're never going to come up with anything new. Now, on this note about how what you think your neighbors think is a good weekend, that also is radical. That goes beyond mere ideology or the explicit level of ideology. I also am thinking about curating environments and cultivating gardens, and I want to bridge that metaphor in a moment. And if I don't get to it, remind me. But first, I got to bring it back to the revolutionary subject before we get into that. I just say I like that you're talking about this circle, and it's kind of wild that so many people who love this term revolution, they're not really tarrying with that fact, right? That it is a circular logic that they're claiming, or at least participating in. What's the circle look like, though? And what I want to talk about now, there's several mechanisms of the PCFM that we can talk about. There's a couple in particular that are worth honing in on right now, because I think it sets us up for this conversation about curating environments and cultivating gardens and homeschool and the rest of it. But I want to say that the one of the circles that revolutionary subject is definitely stuck in is the vicious cycle. Now, the vicious cycle is what I like to talk about as the product of the breakdown of the virtuous circle. Now, you can't come in contact with very much of my work without hearing this terminology, and so I'll spend a brief moment unpacking it. But basically, the virtuous circle is between genuine time with self and genuine time with others. That genuine time with self could include prayer, meditation, journaling, reading, writing. It could, but the point is that you are no from all from the outside, you would just look like you're in isolation. And for a lot of people, isolation and solitude are the same thing. But we're going to use in this conversation the word isolation to get at something where it's like, oh, probably negative, you're isolated, maybe you're lonely, bored, or anxious. Whereas in solitude, there's a fullness, a fulfillment, and a genuine sort of communion. Now, I'm very open right now to the possibility that a communion with yourself that is full is just pure narcissism. And that to get outside of a self-defeating sort of narcissistic loop, you actually can't just be in this sort of full relation with yourself, but you actually have to be triangulating between yourself as you have been, yourself as you are, yourself as you can be. But when I say triangulating, you need a point of reference outside of yourself. And so I think traditionally the way to do that would be God. And so we talked about in the special episode that we had with Benjamin Studebaker, writing for God. What does that mean? Well, you are a particular, and God would be a universal, something that everyone participates in potentially, right? But that no one can fully encompass or understand or totalize. And so, trying to write in a way that gets outside of yourself and says no, there's a truth beyond me. There's a truth beyond me. So it's not just me living my best life, living my truth. No, it's instead going to say I've got to get outside of myself. Even though here I am with myself, I'm getting outside of myself. But for Hannah Arendt, she's a secular person and she's thinking about Socrates, and she's going to say it's the conversation between me and myself. And really, it's the space that opens up between the ego and something else. I think Freud would call it the superego, but I don't think that's fair. Where you basically say, is the life that I am living something that is worth living or something that I could continue living? Can I keep going along with this life that I've been living? This kind of solitude where you're able to live in those kinds of questions opens up the moral space. Okay, so we'll say that. Now, for Sherry Turkle, who's drawing off of Arendt, but also Levinas and also Henry David Thoreau, she's thinking about solitude in this full sense, and she's keen to point out that when that breaks down, and you're not achieving solitude, you're merely isolated. Well, then you're not able to develop a secure sense of self, a chronological sense of self. You're not able to develop those moral capacities. You're also not able to develop your imagination or your creativity or discover your talents, right? And therefore, that what occurs is a breakdown of your ability to have genuine being or time with others. So solicitude, genuine time with other people. Well, when you're not getting that quality time with others, it actually detracts from that quality time with yourself. And so these two things can break down. And it's easy for these things to break down when you live in a culture of distraction and exhaustion. Now, distraction, obviously, we think of our phones. Exhaustion, obviously, we think of our jobs or our homework or our school life. Well, before our society was so dominated by jobs and school in the form that they currently take, much less by the smartphone, these were already problems. These are kind of eternal human problems, but they're problems that have become worse. And I don't want to say that they've simply intensified. No, space and time have imploded in a way that was inconceivable. And that doesn't just accelerate those classic human problems, but there are other perverse outgrowths that are genuinely new, and we must tarry with those. But before saying what those are, before saying what's new there, I just want to say that Kierkegaard and Heidegger are the two main people I'm drawing from to think about the vicious cycle that the revolutionary subject is stuck in, which is to say, everyone is the revolutionary subject, which is to say everybody's stuck revolving or revolting within a circle, right? Well, the vicious cycle is between ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter, right? Ambiguity meaning that we talk, but we don't ever drill down into the roots of the matters themselves. Non-committal curiosity, obviously, you're not living life deliberately. You're living life in what Jean-Paul Sartre would call bad faith. And then finally, idle chatter, just passing the time, chit chat. What's the weather like? Oh, did you hear about what Becky bought? Oh my God, do you know what he did? It's just the kind of things that people get stuck in, right? And of course, now we can bring in Neil Postman, and this is a level beyond where Kierkegaard or Heidegger were at. We're talking about television replacing news with this, now this, now this, now this sort of relativistic disjunctive conjoining, right? So it's like every passage from anything to the next thing separates them and trivializes them to the point where you're saying, yes, nuclear war seems imminent. And now a commercial from Burger King, right? You never have more than 40 seconds to think about anything because it's always on to the next thing. Now this, now this, now this. So that's the vicious cycle. And if the revolutionary subject was the proletariat or the broader working class, and then it became the oppressed minority, today we have little elements of all of those things firmly enshrined in the institutions. And that's because it's no longer about the revolutionary subject. No, for intersectionality, it is about the satisfied consumer. And some satisfied consumers, well, in order to get them satisfied, it's going to require a little bit extra work. And so if they are statistically, historically, a little bit harder to satisfy, then we'll just have to work a little bit more to make sure that they aren't going to be upset with us. And then you get into litigation culture and safetyism and trauma discourse and therapism, right? So all of these things, they all coalesce, they all fit together. And it's very exciting. But this revolutionary subject, stuck in this vicious cycle between ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter, it's really exciting. First of all, because, well, solitude and solicitude are possible. Once you start living deliberately, you can start to say, well, I'm not going to bring my phone into the space with myself when I'm trying to get to know myself or challenge myself or write for God or what have you. Same with genuine time with other people. Notice I haven't been on my phone this whole time. Wow, it's really making it a lot easier to focus on what you're saying, Daniel. Wow. You know, so living deliberately is a big step in that direction. And of course, that's the sort of ideal that Thoreau gives us in Walden. You know, he went to the woods to live deliberately, right? So that he didn't find himself old with his whole life having passed him by wasted, right? Idle chatter, non-committal curiosity, and ambiguity each is a launch pad into a deliberate practice. Ambiguity, finding ourselves always caught up in ambiguous modes of exchange, teaches us that we could actually learn to be more clear, teaches us that we can strive for clarity and understanding. Realizing that we're always non-committally curious makes us realize, oh, it's okay to commit to something. If I'm curious about this thing, I can dig into it deeper. That's allowed. That's allowed. Yeah, that's allowed. The schooling system might not encourage it, but it is allowed. You can allow yourself to do it. You don't need other people to give you permission. But in case you do, we'll give you permission. Daniel and Dave here on the internet will give you permission. You can actually go in deeper to the things that you're interested in. It's okay. Even if you're not going to be able to get a better job doing it, it's okay to honor your interests and specifically those ones that go beyond video games. I mean, and video games are fine, but it's okay to be into things that aren't games, actually. If they're not hyper commodified products, yeah, go in deeper, especially if it's a challenge. right? And then finally, with idle chatter, well, you can have more deliberate conversations. To that end, for the last 10 or 12 years, I've been striving to break from frivolous conversations. Now, of course, I'm totally fine having chit chat with the cashier. Like, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I have, you know, fun, random conversations with people all the time. But striving to cultivate relationships with people who are clear in their communication. I've also really tried to weed out from my life people who are really paranoid, right? Uh, Paranoia and non-clear communication. For me, those are becoming a problem, right? So other people, there might be bigger problems for other people. Maybe, you feel called to work with paranoid people, or you feel called to work with people who are really bad at communication. Well, congratulations, go for it. But for me, I know what I need, and I need to get away from that. And then the last item is just really people who take responsibility seriously, right? Like I've been really realizing how important that is. And so all of this can kind of be uh, umbrellaed under the term deliberate, right? Deliberate living. And of course, when you think of deliberate living, people will also often start talking about intentional communities. And I think that there might be something to that, but I feel like I've also wasted a lot of time trying to do intentional communities with other people. And I'm thinking the most base unit is the home, is the family. Hopefully, it's more of an extended family and not a nuclear family, right? But the nuclear family is like the base unit, right? If you've got to start from scratch, if you don't have parents who can be a part of the picture, if you come from a broken home, if you, like most people in our society, were ripped from a practical and intergenerational context and forced into a confined, uh, compulsory schooling system, then you might have to build from scratch. But the good news is that two people in love, and by in love, I don't mean feeling ooey wooey, but I mean that maybe a little bit of that, but maybe a lot of that. But when I say love, I mean sacrificing for something bigger, for something greater, and specifically for something that's going to last for generations, right? When we're talking about that kind of a project, it really does take two at minimum, and it's something that anybody can do. Even the ugliest motherfuckers on the internet, the ugliest among us can do it. And we know that because Jean-Paul Sartre had no problem with the ladies. He had a problem with commitment, and he had a problem with building a rich intergenerational, loving, sort of family life. But the fact is he could get the ladies too. If he can, then so can you. I just want to say that for the internet. I know there's a lot of lonely guys on the internet looking for answers, and they're digging into philosophy because they're looking for some kind of a direction, and getting out there and getting with people who are potentially going to disagree with you, people who might not, you know, look up to you for all this philosophy that you've been digging into. Organizing with people from churches and other kinds of community organizations, and doing it because it matters to just be with other people who are doing things. That's more important than bunkering down in the niches of the post-class fractured mass on the internet, right? And so that's a big turn with Theory Underground, is saying, get out there, get involved with like multiple churches. You be an atheist who goes to church, be an agnostic who prays, love people and put them before ideology, and don't prioritize finding a bunch of people who agree with you on the internet, right? So I think that's kind of where I wanted to set up to before we can sort of drill into the curating environment, cultivating gardens, homeschool side of things, which will open up the possibility for really getting into this idea of a canon. And specifically, I've got questions for you, Daniel, that I'm going to want to get into about child rearing in the 21st century. It's a complicated thing, and we both have some shared resources to draw off of, but also you've practically just been doing this a lot longer than I have, and so I'm really excited to learn from you about all of that. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to you and get myself some water.
Well, magnificent, and I appreciate all that. Well, a few things come to mind. I very much like what you're saying on the vicious cycle versus the virtuous circle. I think it's very important when people have used the phrase revolutionary subject. Um, Really, the word revolution has almost been like the uprising subject, the subject that uprises, or the subject that overturns, right? But what's very interesting about the idea of a revolutionary subject, if we take that phrase seriously, then we're talking about a kind of feedback subject. Like the subject is always in a feedback loop of something, right? And the subject, as they're in that feedback loop, the subject is shaped by their material condition, which shapes their subjectivity, which shapes their material condition, et cetera, right? And so the idea of a revolutionary subject in one way is that actually everyone is a revolutionary subject in the sense that everyone is in some feedback loop of some kind, right? And they are being formed. And part of the issue is that we haven't thought our feedback loops. We haven't designed our feedback loops. And in fact, we haven't thought much, I think, in terms of feedbacks. We've thought more in terms of us versus them, power dynamics, overturning, et cetera, so forth. But and that would be a kind of classical, I think, old left notion of the revolutionary subject, right? But if you take seriously that actually the problem is bad feedback loops, like you're saying with the vicious cycle, and I completely agree, then the question is how do we change the feedback? How do we change the feedback loop, actually? Which is a little bit, that's a different kind of thinking than how do we overturn the state? How do we overturn oppression, right? Well, what if we were to transform what is functioning as the feedback to the economy, the state, the power, I'll say here, meaning it's slightly different from earlier. But just if you change the feedback, then you change the inputs to it, which can change how it behaves. And then that you can actually use the system against itself, if you will, right? And would not a more effective revolution versus opposing the system be where you can feed a different feedback loop, feed a different demand ultimately, a different way of thinking into the system that then changes the feedback on the system self that makes it change itself, right? As itself, to make it transform the logic internal to it, where when capital is being capital, suddenly it's actually facilitating human beings that are extending their humanity convivially versus replaced, right? Because for me, an effective revolution is going to ultimately have to be something that changes feedback loops, not overturn power, right? And
Mm.
I think very often the old left, to speak generally, and I'm not certainly critiquing all leftists or anything like that, there's been an idea of how we have to overturn capital. We have to overturn capitalism or different things like that. Well, but you see, if the revolutionary subject as classically understood does not exist as the proletariat, then this structure doesn't exist. And actually, capitalism has been far more internalized. And actually, capitalism is now serving the internal states of subjects and shaping the internal state. And it's receiving inputs and demands based on the subjectivity of people, right? Well, that ought to work both ways then. If you change the kind of subjectivity people are and what they want and what they're after, well, then the system actually changes and cultivates to that. It transforms the goods and services that it delivers, and the revolution can be located there, right? But this is where, for me, there are differences between, in much economics, there's talk of supply and demand. I think you need to talk about supply, demand, and creativity because creativity is different. You know, if there is something about people owning the means of production and then working the means of production, there's the question of the creation of the means of production and the ability to create new means of production, to speak very generally and simplistically. And also, too, in my opinion, another reason why you have not seen, I suppose, the idea of a sort of inevitable working class revolution from the alienation caused by their labor and overturn. Another reason why that deterministically has not unfolded is because there's always the possibility of someone to create a new means of production so they can take that alienation in the direction of entrepreneurship or creativity. And thus, it is not inevitable that the alienation leads to an overturning of the bourgeoisie, it could lead to actually a formation of what you could call almost a creator class, or that I have sometimes called in the Creative Concord the artifacts, which is that's a term in Latin that means creators, artisans, and so on and so forth. So you would have the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the artifactians. And you see, the artifactian class can actually be someone who works and creates a means of production. So it actually overlaps the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the alienation of the system, instead of a antagonism, could just actually be directed toward creativity and entrepreneurship. But then, of course, that could be captured too, right? And you could argue that it has today what has been, right? So the artifact, so you could say if the liberating potential of capitalism is in the creative spirit, well, that arguably has gone through a phase and now that has been captured, right? So how do you bring that back, right? Well, there has to be something about the recreation of a certain creativity, which is a loaded word, I understand, that is brought to the subject. Now, to say something very, very vast, but then to speak more on what you're getting at with the homeschooling, because I think this is deliberate living is very important. Belonging again to one, we'll talk about this. I think there has been a lot of focus, especially on the old left, on a certain notion of the working class rising up. I would like to put focus on changing demand, because capitalism, you have supply and demand. Not all demand is the same. I think economists basically conflate stimulating demand and creating demand. We can demand different things, and that changes the inputs to the system, but we have to change what we want in our subjectivity and our habits and get out of vicious circles to change our demands. And if we change our demands, then we get a line of flight from the system without a cheap delusionism that's antagonism. How do you get a line of flight while maintaining social intelligibility? That's always the mass, like what Deleuze is getting at with societies of capture is correct. But then if you get a line of flight, you can be, well, crazy, right? Like I call that cheap Deleuze, where it's a kind of Deleuze where, yeah, you're not captured by capital, but you're unintelligible. Nobody understands you and you can't form community, right? Okay, well, how do you have a line of flight that is nevertheless your own line of flight, to use that language just generally, while also being socially intelligible? Because if you can do that, then your line of flight could actually change the demand in the economy to change the supply and to change. So a socially intelligible line of flight can change the quality of the demand to which the economy is responding to, that can then change what it is, right? So you're locating the revolution in transforming the inputs of demand to the system, right? And changing what exactly you want. And then the system, in order to then even be itself, has to start serving that. So for example, if you yourself as a subject were to engage in deliberate living, create habits of that, show that to other people, well, the system, in order to serve you, is now going to have to help you with deliberate living. And it's going to have to serve deliberate living. And it's going to have to be good at it, right? And so you've actually then shifted the system in a revolutionary way by transforming that which it is catering to, right? Because you're changing demand. A lot of economic theory, in my opinion, has basically said that demand comes from supply. Whatever the supplies is, that stimulates people, and then you use marketing to convince them to want it, right? Like you could argue, some people have, is that after World War II, the only way they could keep a post-war economy strong was to basically invent marketing to try to trick you, well, to convince you you want things you don't need, right? Now, some economists and Austrians argue that's too simplistic, but regardless what you think of it, there is something to be said that the American economy, well, certainly the American economy is the largest consumer economy in the world, right? Like we consume a lot. And you could argue some of that is tied to marketing, and that gets into where ideology critique can be important, because some of the ways that people's demand is stimulated to consume is by using tools of ideology and enjoyment liaisons, et cetera, so forth, precisely to make them plug into the system. And that's all quite valid. But the issue is that if what the system has basically done is keep itself going by a stimulation of demand, if I use that very generally, and we talk about Keynes and the general theory and belonging into one, and the problems of a demand economy, and thinking the problem of demand in economics. But the revolutionary act, then, in my opinion, is in being the kind of subject that, instead of having your demand stimulated, is one who can create your demand, who is actually able to, through deliberate living, put a demand on yourself. Because when you say the word deliberate living, in a sense, you're saying, I'm going to put a demand on myself to live a certain way. I'm not going to be ambiguous. I'm going to actually seek clarity. I'm not going to engage in idle chatter. I'm going to try to move beyond trivial education, as I like to put it, inspired by Neil Postman. I'm going to actually like try to have commitment. I'm going to let my not just, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. No, 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 no. I'm going to be locked in, right? I'm actually going to be deliberate about those things, which means I'm going to put a demand on myself to get out of the vicious cycle, which then changes the kind of demand I have for the economy, for the society, right? And then the feedback loop starts to change. I've changed the feedback loop on myself. And in a small way, I've changed the feedback loop on the entire system, right? And that sort of thinking, I think the issue is if we think only the revolutionary subject, if you will, in terms of a certain rising up and overcoming, as opposed to the revolutionary subject is a feedback subject, and I can change the feedback by putting a different demand on myself and having a deliberate way of living, well, then the act of a commitment to a way of life that will change your habits to make you have different demands is the truest revolutionary act, because it is the one that can use the logic internal to capital on itself to sublate it in something that is more human. But the only way to do that is to be deliberate, because if you're not deliberate, you're going to be captured by the zeitgeist or just absorb ideas you don't even realize you've absorbed, and you're going to be stumbling into idle chatter, ambiguity, and a lack of commitment, and then one day realize you never did those things and you've been in a vicious cycle and you didn't realize it. The last thing I'll say, and they give it back to you, a beloved friend of mine, Owen in the Agon, he has been doing a fascinating class on Plato's elite pedagogy. And he actually asks a question. He makes a point that's so obvious now, I feel really stupid. He's like, you know, when Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth, that has to mean that's an educational issue. He's saying they were being educated in a way that corrupted them, right? Because you hear the word corrupt and you're like, oh, he was like, what does that mean? It means Plato, it means Socrates was introducing an educational program that was somehow a threat to the social order, if you will, right? So the way I kind of associate that, this is simplistic, but it's like you know, in Dead Poets Society, where Robin Williams is telling the kids it's okay to do poetry, but like he's corrupting the youth. Because, you know, if you're not going to get a job, you're going to do play. The parents are all concerned. Like the parents are seeing the kids corrupted, right? And so, you know, we do, even to this day, feel as if getting a degree in the humanities or studying philosophy is a certain corruption, because you're not going to get paid, you're not going to get a job, and you're going to be in real trouble, right? That is basically what Owen is trying to point out. And I think this is a very interesting point, is that the birth of philosophy cannot be separated from a time of social, governmental, political tension in which the question of what education is was arising. Philosophy is inseparable from the question of what even is education. And what Socrates is interestingly presenting is that education basically has to choose between reifying the logic that people think is good for the youth and the logic that may actually say, quote unquote, corrupt the youth, but that actually being what can get them out of the vicious cycle. And the great irony is often that which supposedly is corrupting the youth is that which gets them out of the vicious cycle, where that of which is making the most of the potential of the youth is that of which is reifying the vicious cycle, right? And so to me, what's so interesting of Owen's point, and his channel is tremendous, he's quite a scholar, is that to me, when I think about that, and think about philosophy has always been birthed with the question of what education is. And education then is the revolutionary act then. Like at the heart of revolution is a question not of overturning people oppressing you, but changing what you believe it means to be educated, which ultimately what Socrates is saying, it's the ability to not just have your internal state conditioned by the external environment, which makes you impossible of thinking beyond it. Then if that's actually the revolutionary act, which makes sense because that would also change your demand and what you demanded of the economy to change the inputs, to change how the system unfolds, well, then that starts in the home. The reason it starts in the home is the following reason. If your kid tells you that they're interested in literature and you as the parents say that's not going to give you a job, then you have contributed to the loss of humanity and our replacement by AI versus our extension. It's humanity's extension. So we actually, then what's very interesting, and then I'll give it to you, like as a parent, the first thing that comes to mind in all of this, and feel free to respond to any of it, is that if I take all of this very, very seriously, then I always have to be balancing and thinking seriously what's good with my children for my children in terms of the practical and their future, but then also in terms of their humanity, and realizing that concerns about the practical is going to naturally be more vivid to me versus the activities that have the human qualities that they need to not get stuck in a vicious cycle. And then that also transforms as a parent, you're thinking, okay, well, how are they doing education now that is going to lead them more on the side of the ability to not get stuck in a single way of thinking, but also not introducing it to them too quickly or in a manner that has no guidance, because then it's just overwhelming. If like, well, just do whatever you want. Well, there's not enough guidance, right? But then if there's too much guidance, you're in trouble. But this right there also, as the parent, one of the most valuable things in the world then is your ability to judge the mean, as an Aristotle would say, the proportion, the fitting balance between those things, right? That actually, if you take all of this very seriously, becomes one of the most important things in the world. And you can't buy that at Walmart. You can't buy that at the store. The thing you want, you cannot buy. And so the demand that you're putting on yourself is to cultivate something that is not simply readily given to you by the store, but there may be resources from the system that could help, but you have to think more creatively. You have to think more creatively. And if creativity is a central third of supply, demand, and creativity, then you're also reintroducing to the economy something that can change the way demand manifests, because, and then I'll give it to you, a change in the quality of demand, in my opinion, that changes the feedback loop to the overall system is always going to start with a change in the kind of demand you put on yourself. Do you demand yourself to learn the capacity to judge the mean between the practical and the human, between the ability to be creative, but also to be structured, to judge all of these means? Are you going to put on yourself the demand to work those tensions? Because if you do not, then no, you cannot be a node, a point in which the feedback loop to the system changes that can then actually begin to change the overall system in new ways. So it has to start, I think, with deliberate living. I think that's a wonderful way to put it.
Beautiful. So where are we so far? We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered a lot. And I think all of this kind of opened up from the post-class fractured mass as a critique of the old revolutionary subject, or the old new left revolutionary subject. And the new left, its revolutionary subject, is a satisfied consumer subject. And of course, it's stuck in this vicious cycle. Now we're talking about ways of breaking that feedback loop, or of turning it from a positive into a negative, or negative into a positive, whatever that means in cybernetic terms. But I also want to touch on the idea that the post-class fracture mass is, for me, primarily three mechanisms. Now, there's a bunch of other mechanisms, but the three that I think matter the most for really digging into are the medium, the school, and gerrymandering the Finlichkeit. Now, we spent a lot of time doing all of that, and I think it's worth touching on some of them. But for right now, I also want to say on this whole thing about creating demand, and that being an incisive point for not just resistance in the sense of saving your own humanity, but also of actually changing the broader system. I think that is what time energy gets at. Time energy is a concept. Now, of course, for those who don't know, I have a book by that title, Time Energy: Why You Have No Time or Energy. Time energy is a technical term. It's one word. It's Timenergy. It's worth saying that because I've been out here saying this stuff for years, and people who've seen it for years, they'll still spell it with two E's in the middle, or whatever. But no, time energy, it's a unified whole, and that's supposed to symbolize the fact that it comes before time and energy get separated, and fragmented in a society of divorce, a society of exhaustion and divorce. Well, it's a technical concept that means large energy infused, repeatable blocks of time reliably available to people, or you could say societally available. Large energy infused, repeatable blocks of time societally available. Well, you don't get that in a job-centric society where every bit of science is being used to squeeze out every last drop of time or energy from our waking lives in the ultimate reduction of all humanity to a standing reserve of labor power. In such a society, what it means to live deliberately and to create a new kind of demand, in part means showing people that there is a life beyond the job, showing people that there is a life beyond the wage labor job or beyond the career. So a professional career and a wage labor job are typically not considered the same thing. Like you are either working wage labor jobs or you are career track. And of course, you might work some wage labor jobs on your way towards that career track. But the point is that in neither case are you supposed to prioritize a life outside of that job or career. Timenergy as the precondition for labor power. It's sort of the necessary ingredient for what becomes labor power in the mechanized, sort of industrialized, corporate, capitalist world that we live in, is also the precondition or you could say key ingredient for skole or otium, which is to say active leisure. Now, active leisure as skole, the Greek word skole, it's the root of the word school. In traditional education, meaning like traditional aristocratic education, the kind of education that nobody has really had since maybe the time of Winston Churchill, and even then, just really people belonging to his class. There were not that many families in England at the time who got to live this way. There was, I think less than 150 families that got to live this level. But in that world, they had a life outside of work. They had a life outside of a career, and it was time to spend doing sports and arts, right? Now, the liberal arts, the word liberal in the liberal arts, it gets at liberation. Liberation from what? It's liberation from menial and mundane labor and preoccupation with necessary reproduction of life. So obviously, for someone like Winston Churchill, he gets to be liberated from a preoccupation with necessary labor because other people are being paid to do it for him. Now, for us, that's not going to be the case. We still actually have to survive. We still also have to, preoccupy ourselves with thriving. And part of that does mean managing our finances and making sure that we have income, right? Some jobs are better than other ones, though. Some are worse than others. Some careers are better than others, and some are worse. That's the first most important sort of step here. Some are better than others. Some give you more of an opportunity to cultivate your higher capacities. Okay, unless something magically happens overnight, none of us are going to get to live in Winston Churchill's sort of world, right? But I do think that the idea that the good life is in part liberation from a preoccupation with necessary labor, and that now includes both the job and the career, I think that is a good sort of direction to go in, And so I'm not saying, oh yeah, full automation and UBI, those are the demands. We just need to make those demands on the system. I'm not saying that at all. I think that that's a sort of left accelerationist utopianism. You see it in Inventing the Future by Cernicek and Williams. I'm not talking about that, even though it's a great book. No, I'm talking about something a lot more practical, right? And in part, that means making sure that people come into a deep understanding of the difference between playing video games and the violin, between playing video games and learning languages, between watching TV and kicking around a soccer ball, right? And we're talking about different qualities in terms of activities. There are obviously, one out of a million players of a given video game is going to be able to make a career of sorts playing it. And he, assuming it's a he, might actually be able to find love still. It's possible. Uh, but most people, that's not going to work for them. In fact, most people, you actually have to do things. And the arts and sports, these are actual ways of being a whole human being and getting outside of yourself and participating in a broader kind of community that is not this hyper reality that is meant to replace having a life outside of your job. The PS5 is meant to replace having a life outside of your job, whereas the violin, you can't level up and master it nearly as fast as you could level up and master a video game, right? Or becoming a virtuoso at any sport or art, much less developing up any kind of serious community, the kind that requires routine showing up. These kind of things require the discomfort and friction of getting out there, which is especially difficult for people who are exhausted. So I'm not trying to act like this is some easy thing. Oh, working people, if you just tried to live like Winston Churchill, you could do it. I'm not saying that. Of course, it's going to be a struggle, but so what? That's the name of the game. Now get after it, right? And getting after it actually will form the self in a way that helps you get beyond the self. And incidentally, bringing it back to my dating advice from earlier, it'll actually make you more attractive, right? If you get off the PS5 and you actually go out there and do things with people who are different than you are, and play musical instruments, and read great books, and kick around the soccer ball, or do jujitsu and Muay Thai, whatever it is. Now, it's easier said than done, which means that the ability to do it draws off of scarce resources. Well, scarcity is actually the basis of desire in a sort of sense. So actually, this is good if we're thinking about what's a kind of desire or kind of demand that could be created and levied against the system to sort of help short circuit things to make it so that people want something beyond what can be commodified to be able to be cheaply bought and consumed. Well, once people realize that there are qualitative distinctions between the kinds of things that can be purchased with consumer dollars that you were given in exchange for your entire waking life's time energy reduced to labor power, as soon as they realize that there's a different kind of thing that you can undertake, a different kind of project, a different kind of direction that you can go, but it requires time energy. Now people have real challenges and real goals, and it's not something that's unprecedented, like it's never been done. No, I already said Winston Churchill had that quality of life. Other people could have that quality of life too. Technology is at a point where we could organize society differently, not so that there's no more work, but just so that the kind of work that remains is a more noble kind of work, right? What is the most noble kind of work? Well, I want to hone in on parenting and growing food, which is to say building soil and cultivating souls. Yeah, that's the direction that I want to take this in. And a sort of segue there then from time energy into what we're talking about would be the T3 institutions or T cubed institutions, right? Time energy, tutelage, and talent. You have to have the time energy to discover the talents that can then only be cultivated under tutelage, provided that you have a rich intergenerational context with other people who are also living a passion-driven life. Without those things, without those priors, you're just out there doing it alone. Well, thankfully, we have these means for communication so that you and I and other people are able to sort of take a break from touching grass out there in the real world, doing real things with real people. And we were able to kind of like put our heads together and be like, hey, how's it going? Yeah, it's going. Oh, we're doing it. Yeah, we're doing it. And not only are we doing it by talking about doing it, other people who aren't doing it are able to go, I could do that. Oh, well, what do you know? This is literally a thing that you could do. And so on this whole idea of tending soil and uplifting or edifying or cultivating souls and talents under tutelage, we get into curating our environment. And of course, this makes me think of the family. This makes me think of the homestead. This makes me think of soil and gardens and farms, and ultimately broader networks of people who are doing homeschool work. And of course, for people who are just really into philosophy or theory, I want to say, Wittgenstein and Hegel both took sizable breaks during their philosophical careers to teach elementary school. Okay, I'm not saying you have to do it like they did, but I'm just saying I am really excited to bring life into this world and to raise children, sharing my passion for every subject matter that is relevant to the life of the mind or the work of the hands, so that I can get them stoked on it as well. And then instead of like memorizing for standardized tests or what have you, it's instead like, no, let's understand the ecosystem that we live in. Let's understand the chemistry, the biology, the physics, the math of this farm. Let's understand the poetry of this riverbed. Let's understand, you know what I mean? Like there's a whole world of liberal arts right there in every local part of the world. And then, of course, by getting to know any local part of the world intimately, there's a bridge into now being able to know other places deeper, other people deeper. But you can't know other places or people deeper if you don't know your own place in a deep sense. And so instead of learning the liberating arts within these sort of sterilized, confined, coerced, sort of prison-like facilities, we can learn it while making healthy food for ourselves and for our neighbors and our friends. And I think that's an exciting direction to be going in. And I have a big question for you now that will be about curating that environment. But first, I'll hand it back over to you.
Tremendous. You said a lot there. That's right at it. Very, very well said. I'll point to something very important that you pointed at, where if a lot of the logic of capitalism, and I know Illich and others, Plonier and others complexify it, if the idea that what is scarce is what is valuable. Well, if time energy is scarce, then shouldn't there be an opportunity for that of which is able to provide time energy would therefore be able to create value and therefore could be a functioning business or a successful enterprise that should be able to do very well? Yeah. The issue, though, is that you have to have people want time energy or even know what it is. You have to create markets, like Plonier will emphasize, right? So how do you create a market or a demand for time energy where people, because they may feel it, and like once they hear it, they know they don't have it, but they have to know that it is a thing that they can even want, and then that of which could provide said time energy would then be able to serve them and thus change demand in the system and have all of these transformations we're talking about. Well, that's where the work of Theory Underground to talk about it, to create the market, to create the idea. There has to be a change in the idea that would change what people see as a potential scarcity, which would create a potential value, of which would then short circuit the system. As right now, you could argue is that the problem of the system is its inability to provide time energy, not the fact that the system has a pricing mechanism or that it even provides goods and services. And like all of that is not so much the problem. The problem is that it's the logic of capital. Like, there are books like Adam Smith and Beijing, other books that make distinctions between capitalism and markets, right? A problem with capitalism is not that it has a market necessarily. I like to be able to buy things. You actually don't want to live in a world where you don't have any way to access price, the distribution of goods and services, et cetera, so forth, right? Pricing mechanisms, hike, et cetera, so forth, right? The problem is that capitalism does this at the expense of time energy. But if indeed time energy was to become something intelligible to people, that therefore they could value, then it is not theoretically impossible. And in fact, it would be, dare I say, rational then of capitalism to provide that very time energy. And that would be a fundamental change in what it is, right? It would transform into something that is antagonistic to time energy, and actually you could say sublate it into its own operations. And really the way that one is going to overturn the problem of capital that is leading to, the AI and the self-effacement and different things is precisely a short-circuiting of exactly the very thing that it is providing to, but you do that by changing the demand according to which its own internal logic operates, which is a very real possibility once you make time energy intelligible to people, which is at the same time making intelligible its scarcity and therefore a potential for value. Now, of course, we have to get into detail on that because there's also a fallacy, as Ivan Illich warns about, between the creation of scarcity. Actually, this is what I want to say, because Illich warns that, markets have created scarcity to create markets. So they've intentionally limited access toward things precisely so that there are businesses. Like, for example, to get people reliant on experts and services, well, then I'm going to make sure that people lack, say, the skill to build their own home, right? Because if they're not able to build their own home, then they require an expert, right? So you've created a scarcity of people who have the ability to build a home precisely to make a market of home builders, right? And he also talks about regulation, and disablement is a very important point in Ivan Illich. And there's been a certain he'll talk about how the system has disabled us precisely so that it can provide a service for that of which we are disabled from doing it, and thus creating a market. So there is a way where the idea of scarcity can be used intentionally by the system to create scarcity through disabling people in order to create markets, and that's very problematic. But then the question becomes, okay, but what is the most fundamental actual scarcity versus an arbitrary created scarcity? Well, you could argue it's time and energy, because those are always things that are being used up, and you certainly have a limited amount of time. And so the scarcity of time and energy is actually fundamental. And then what's even more scarce is the conditions of which keep them as time energy versus separated, right? And that's a fundamental scarcity that is not arbitrarily created, but actually defines the human condition. So that scarcity, which is the condition of the possibility of all other scarcities, the value that is the condition of possibility for all other values, if that's not being, so here's the issue. If capitalism is not serving that, then it is actually not serving the fundamental condition to assure that the scarcities that are served are not arbitrarily created and actually just serving capital versus the human being that needs to be served in various ways and actually to extend their humanity, to make distinctions between the convivial and the manipulative. But you have to identify the actual fundamental scarcity as opposed to the arbitrary scarcities that are created. And that is ultimately, well, time and energy, and then more so time energy. Right? And the more that becomes intelligible to people, the more they can demand it. They can change their demand. They can change their wants, and in changing their wants, the system has to change or it goes bankrupt, or it has no consumers. It has no one to on offer. So it's very important. Also, too, there is so on this idea, well, people are exhausted. It's true, people are exhausted. So how do they, kind of engage in these transformations, learning the instrument, getting out of the vicious cycle? How do you even begin? What I would personally say is one of the first things you can do is just think about, instead of thinking about learning the violin, start with regaining curiosity. Regaining curiosity is where it all begins. And actually, there is a profound, underappreciated connection between intimacy and curiosity. Your spouse And Benita Roy, who I adore, made this point with Jacob Kashir the other day, but it's very true, and Michelle and I talk about it a lot. When spouses want to feel that the other is curious about them. Like to make someone feel like you intimately care about them, you show curiosity. You don't just do the dishes or serve them. You show genuine curiosity. Curiosity and intimacy are deeply connected. Well, so likewise, curiosity about life and love of life are deeply connected. Having friends that will go to follow a curiosity is going to make that relationship feel deeper. And also a conversation that feels like it's following a thread, which following a thread is following a curiosity, will feel like a more intimate and deeper conversation, right? If you do not regain curiosity, you will not regain intimacy. I think you'll have a lacking view of intimacy. So therefore, if you're a guy and you're in your basement, you're exhausted and you want, well, learn curiosity. If you can show girl, if guy, all of that. So this is dating advice. Learning the ability to have genuine curiosity in the other is a basis of romance. And it's extremely, extremely important. And you will also not want to be married with someone of whom you cannot genuinely share curiosity with about one another. And also your children will greatly benefit from seeing parents who are genuinely curious about one another. And if the kid, and this is major step one to creating an environment of education, of an alternative way of children being raised that is leading them to a different mode of subjectivity and thus a different way of demand and a different way of like if the parents do not model a constant curiosity in one another that the children indirectly experience and thus just becomes what you do, then you can come up with whatever educational program you want and it will not be able to get its foot off. It won't get going. So likewise, if you're exhausted and it's like, how do I even start? We'll start with regaining curiosity. And that doesn't require you to take violin lessons or to change your radical life. Figure like Simone Weil would talk about regaining attention. And I really do associate attention. Ivan Illich talks about regaining awareness. There's something about as you are currently in your current life situation, look at yourself and ask, do I have the feeling of curiosity at all? If not, make it your goal to first regain that. As you go to work, think about what am I curious about, and then give yourself permission to pursue it, right? And work on regaining curiosity, because here's the thing, curiosity energizes. One of the key ways you overcome exhaustion is to have curiosity, because there's something mysterious about curiosity and energy. It gives you kind of life, right? And in that, also that curiosity, in giving you more energy, well, then you are gaining more of what you need to regain time energy. Also, here's the other reason why I'm emphasizing curiosity. The economy is mostly responding to wants. Curiosity is a sublation of want. Instead of having your life driven by desires and wants, if your life is driven by curiosity, it's more of a driven of drive, as a Lacan might say, instead of the objects, right? So to have your life mostly be guided by curiosity, which is also the precondition of intimacy, is actually then to have your thinking less guided by wants and instead following a thread of your own unfolding and your own thought, which will change the kind of inputs you give to the system, which will change the kind of demand, ergo, and that will thus have a different feedback loop to the system, right? So most consumers have wants, and the system serves wants. Well, if you as a quote unquote consumer become curious, then you have curiosity and the system has to serve curiosity instead of wants. Thus, it has to facilitate environments. Thus, it has to create spaces. Thus, it has to give you time energy because you want curiosity. You want to explore your curiosity. And all they're offering you is bobbleheads and objects. That's not what I want. Oh, well, we somehow have to create spaces where you can pursue your curiosity and get better at it, or otherwise you're not buying anything. Oh, and that ultimately require giving you time energy. So by becoming a subject or quote unquote consumer of curiosity, I suppose, a follower of curiosity, I'm sure there's a different term, then again, that changes the feedback loop. So most of us right now, like if you can start with how do I regain curiosity? Which again is not so much needing, you don't have to change anything about your life right now. I know it's not so simple because you can't separate the external and the internal state, and there are habits that are given. There's not a, it's that's the whole point of sociology in many respects, is that realization. But if you at least make yourself realize the first thing I need to do that leads to a whole lot more and becomes a positive feedback loop to gain more energy is on regaining curiosity, then I think that is a fundamental thing to focus on that you can begin. And honestly, too, I will say this. This is a working assumption I have. And then we can get into the other question. There's also simply the question of, does everyone actually naturally have curiosities? Because if that is true, then if you don't have curiosity, it's more of actually getting something out of the way that is blocking your curiosity versus adding something. So I've never met a child that isn't naturally curious. Like they all naturally ask questions. They're naturally curious about things. If that's the case, then I don't think curiosity is probably a personality trait. I don't think it is particular. I think it is something that is universal. It's just that we get reasons to block it because our dad made us, yelled at us when we read poetry or we were told it was impractical. I think most of us have repressed, if you will, our curiosity. We've snuffed it out, right, and told us it's dumb. The reason why that's extremely important is because then regaining curiosity is actually more of a looking at yourself to figure out a letting, as a Thomas Wynne would say with Heidegger. It's more of a getting something out of the way versus adding something to yourself. And that is a much more feasible goal than saying, well, how do I add something I don't have? Or how do I add 100 hours to my week to cultivate this thing? If it is the case that curiosity is something that humans naturally have, which is tied to intimacy, and it's simply that over the years we block it or get into habits that snuff it out or kind of dismiss it, well, then all we have to do is let that be, right? And actually, funny enough, the last thing I'll say is in that kind of idea in psychoanalysis that repression is very problematic, and this gets tied to the libido, and we need to not repress the libido or you get, all of these psychological disorders. Well, I would like to put emphasis on the repression of curiosity, actually, because I think libido and curiosity are tied together. And actually, when we're emphasizing, say, the sexual a little bit, like the repression of the sexual, I think this is a bit, I don't want to say entirely wrong, but it is a bit misguided because ultimately the libido, I think, is actually tied to a kind of life drive that is tied to curiosity because it's tied to intimacy and it's tied to creation, right? And so if you are, let me put it this way, if you are expressing libido, the sexual urge, however we want to put it, although libido and sexual are not exactly similes, that's simplistic. But if you grant it to me here, if we are working against or deconstructing those repressions, or we're deconstructing norms in a Foucaultian sense, or we're tearing down all of these things, but we're at the end of the day, we're still actually repressing curiosity, then all of these are false revolutions again. These are all false. They seem as if, oh, yes, we're liberating ourselves because we're removing these repressions that are holding us back. But if actually all of these supposed overcomings of repression are secretly concealing a continual repression of curiosity, of letting yourself pursue something of interest as an end in its own sake, then you haven't dealt with the most fundamental repression. And therefore, you cannot change as a subject that will change the demand to the system to create a feedback loop that will change how it is serving you, that would perhaps begin having to serve up time energy and changing its fundamental logic from one that destroys time energy, because what you want is spaces in which your curiosity can unfold, and that makes you a different kind of economic participant, and the system will have to adjust to get your business. And so I think there is a deep fundamental repression of curiosity, which then, ironically, this is my ultimate, ironically, if curiosity is tied to intimacy, then that means in the releasing of libido, we've repressed intimacy. And I think we're seeing that, like you were talking with Michelle about, there's this loss of intimacy in relationships, this loss of it, having children, people, there's a loss of intimacy. Yes. Because if you continue to repress curiosity or not cultivate curiosity, but liberate sex or libido, whatever, or personal expression, then you're not going to have intimacy, because intimacy is always tied to curiosity. And that will be tied to intimacy with yourself, intimacy with others, intimacy with life. And if you don't have that, then you will be in a vicious cycle. You will not know a virtuous cycle, and you will not have a feedback loop that you will find the human extended by.
Uh, quick clarifying question. You said reclaiming attention is Simone Weil and reclaiming curiosity is Ivan Illich. Is that correct? Is that what you
uh,
said?
Illich he talks about awareness, and
Oh,
Simone Weil
awareness.
talks about attention, but I basically think it's the same thing. And it's very, McGilchrist with his work on The Master and the Embassy talks about left and right, and he talks about attention. There's a lot of thinkers now. And A.E. Robert, he put out a lovely book on attention at the base camp. A lot of thinkers are reclaiming this idea because it's kind of
Yeah,
reclaiming
for sure.
focus given attentionalism. I personally am connecting all of that with curiosity.
Right,
And
right,
that
right.
that one of the reasons why regaining attention is so important is because it is also a reclaiming or a releasing of curiosity. Because what you have attention to and have the through line on, also that training habituates yourself to curiosity. I'm happy to say more, but there's
Right,
a
right, right,
connection
right,
between
right,
those.
right, right. Totally, totally. Attention, awareness, curiosity. I like them all. I will agree with you 100% the way that you're using these words. I have a reason for not using curiosity the way that you're using it, but uh this is why I tend to just add non-committal when I'm
Yeah,
talking
sure,
about
sure, sure,
curiosity.
sure.
Because
Yeah.
if you read Heidegger, like for instance, the John Macri and Robinson translation, non-committal is not part of the language they're using. They're just saying it's ambiguity, curiosity, and idle talk.
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
thing
yeah,
is,
yeah,
is
yeah.
I bring in non-committal curiosity because if you actually read and pay attention, that is obviously what Heidegger's getting at, the use in context and also clarifying things that he says. But the the hesitation with the word curiosity is also just that it is something that gets celebrated in the schooling system. They want to they talk about we curiosity and now I think what we could do is just say yes, it's a noble concept that's been captured. Let's just reclaim it. But also, I think just colloquially, curiosity is like, hey, if you keep an open, curious mind, then anything anyone is talking about could be interesting. But I want to drive a big wedge between what's interesting and what's interesting. And so I think I can get at that by talking about, a schooling system that rewards you being curious about the different interests of different authority figures and arbitrary standardized tests, whatever it is that they want you to be focusing on in the moment, and the interests that you might have in a passing day. So somebody mentions, like in this conversation you just mentioned, the Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary. Okay, well, I've already actually recorded an MP3 of that book. Uh, I put the PDF into a robot reader. I have the MP3 queued up on my phone here. I could start listening to it after our conversation, just as a reminder to go a little deeper into that. Well, what I'm getting at is that anytime somebody who I like or respect brings up a book, I am curious, but it's not the curiosity of I'm scrolling on TikTok or Instagram and it's showing me something, right? So like there are levels to curiosity and there are levels to the interests. Are they the interests of random others? Are they the interests of private interests or corporations or algorithms or are they the interests of friends, of family? And of course, if you can't get interested in the interests of friends or family, you might have a problem. And that might be where what you're talking about, this kind of curiosity, is essential for intimacy. And I think that's really deep. And now I want to look into Benita Roy. That's really interesting. I'll definitely check it out. Send me the link for whatever it is or share it down below. But I want to say that the way that I talk about this with students is like, you spend a lot of your life being guilt tripped for having interests that are not the interests of either entertainment or school. But you have interests that occur to you like, oh, the Master and His Emissary. I should look into that book, right? Someone at Theory Underground named David Ruiz, he referenced that book a few times, and that's why I initially checked it out. Well, any book that people keep mentioning, I'll check out. Benjamin Studebaker keeps talking about The Holdover. Oh, okay, so then I got The Holdover. Anna's Archive makes it really easy to download like any book that anybody ever references. And then Speechify makes it easy to play that. And so I'm not saying that I follow everyone's book recommendations to the conclusion. What I do though is give myself permission to check out enough of it to know, what it might be good for later, when I might want to come back to it. And so there's a non-committal curiosity where it's like, oh, tell me more about that book. And then a slightly more deliberate or committed curiosity that's going to say, oh, I'm not even going to think about it. I'm just going to at least listen to half of the introduction or chapter one, and that's my minimum whenever people start mentioning books. If I like them, if I respect them, then I'll do at least the first half of the introduction or chapter one. Uh, well, that doesn't mean that it's my interest. I mean, I'm interested in you. I'm interested in Benjamin. I'm interested in Ruiz. I'm interested in Michelle. I'm interested in Anne, in the sense that your interests are interesting. They are inherently interesting. Uh, that doesn't mean that any book any one of you recommends is going to become my interest, like actually a big part of my own project. It might. And so there's this separation between my interests, your interests, and their interests. Now, of course, we could always talk about our interests as well, but these are all different levels to these terms. And of course, we're always at this level talking about conscious interest. We're not talking about something unconscious, which would be a lot more complicated. But let's just go with this for a minute. And I'm going to use a little bit of a framework I used towards the end of my first book, Waypoint, where I talked about, you have like a curiosity and you might check something out. But after checking it out, it might turn into a real interest, right? So I'm at the point right now where jujitsu is not a curiosity. It's like, that's a real interest of mine. I like it. I think it's great. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that it's something that is raging on its own, taking me over all the time, right? I actually have to feed that fire, and so I use the metaphor of a fire, and the difference between an interest and a passion is really just a difference between getting a fire going and getting it raging, right? It's a passion at the point that it's raging. And the thing is you can throw too much wood on that fire and it can go out. You can throw too much green wood on that fire. It might not have enough oxygen. You're not letting it breathe. So there's all kinds of things you could do with this metaphor, and I love that. But now I want to segue it into this conversation about curating environment and television, and just basically say, for Postman, one of the big things is that that implosion of time and of space that I referenced earlier that happens with the television, which creates a radically disproportionate action. What is it? What does he call it? Is it information action ratio? Yeah. So you have way too much information that you can't really act on. The information action ratio would be to say you are through the news getting information all day, every day that you can't act on. Now, if the news was like something that people were sharing around the fire, and it's always like friends, family, and fellow travelers, or people who are, strangers who are passing through, and it's always like stuff about the territory. Oh yeah, there was a forest fire 5 years ago, and I heard that there's another forest fire 20 years ago. Oh wow, that's really interesting. Well, that is interesting because it gives you a sense that forest fires do happen around here, right? Or you could there was a bear just a week from here, like on our journey, there was a bear, and it was actually like it was very, very aggressive. Oh, good to know. Aggressive bear, not too far away. We can act on that information. But most of the news that we get is not information that we can act on. And so there's a sort of paralysis imposed by TMI. So TMI is usually used as like, oh, people are oversharing, right? Well, there's a double sense to TMI when I'm talking about the message of the medium, where I'll say TMI, yeah, people are oversharing, but also TMI, as in there's too much information to systematize, to sort through, to figure out what to do with. So that's where we get to the information action ratio. getting radically disproportionate and creating a kind of paralysis. And then, of course, the TMI gets connected with a fear of missing out, FOMO, and that equals ADHD. So I like to say TMI plus FOMO equals ADHD. And of course, I'm using ADHD in a double sense as well, which is to say, it's not just that you are hyperactive and distracted, it's also to say you actually have been neglected from genuine attention from other people. And so it goes both ways. Um, Television, it was what first caused this implosion in the most obvious way, and so McLuhan thought we were going to move into a global village. Of course, it was the opposite. And then that fragmenting of the public got hyper fractured and kaleidoscopic with the smartphone. But the smartphone is not just an intensification of the TV. And I just keep going back to this because everybody always thinks the TV in your pocket is just an intensification of the problems of the TV. But it's worse because it actually gives us a semblance of control or a semblance of being able to respond. So critical theory in the 20th century was saying that the problem with the TV is that it's one directional. Well, the problem with the smartphone is that it's seemingly two directional, and it's not actually. So, what are we to do about it? Especially if we want to, raise families today. How do you deal with kids who will want phones? How do you deal with kids who will want to watch TV or movies? Growing up in my household, I was homeschooled. We would only watch movies on Friday nights. Mom and dad always watched them ahead of time so as to preview them to make sure that they were appropriate. And so this was, before the internet made it easy. Nowadays, the internet makes it pretty easy for parents to know if there's a sex scene or whatever. But it used to be a lot harder for them to know how age appropriate any given movie might be for their kids. And so they would preview it. And then sometimes those movies we would never end up seeing because they were like, no, there's no way we're showing that to the kids. Other times they're like, yeah, we'll show this to the kids. And so Friday nights were like a really special night. And I really loved watching movies with the family. Um, well, the rest of the week, the TV was unplugged and there was no antenna. And so we received no television whatsoever. If you connected it and then you use the antenna and then you use some tin foil and you wiggle things a certain way, sometimes you could get a little something. And when 9/11 happened, I remember they were like, Dad rigged it so that we could actually follow the news that one day. But outside of 9/11, growing up, we had no television, right? And it was just VHS, VCR. And so one of the things that I've thought about, with homeschool and homestead and farm and all of this other stuff is like, well, what if you gamify it? What if you make it so that, the kids go and move the chicken tractors, which is to say like the polyface farming, moving cages with the chickens. We call them chicken tractors. They go move the chicken tractors, feed the chickens, water the chickens, do a little weeding. They get points for doing these things. And those are points that they can actually cash out for time on a console that allows them to watch a certain set of movies that are just available on it or play games, for instance. And of course, with Raspberry Pi and programming, it wouldn't be that difficult to actually set it all up so that it's not, the typical console that people think of, but it's instead like a new kind of technology where it's like the points from the chores and from the kinds of homework that we're actually doing there, it actually cashes out, like it gives them a certain amount of time and before it gets cut off and the machine cuts them off. It's not mom and dad coming and saying, all right, you're done. We got to unplug it from, the wall. No, it's hardwired to just cut itself off after a certain point. So you've removed the certain one of the hardships of parenting. You've removed that hardship, and now it's like the machine is the bad guy. It's not you. It's just like it's just the game. It's just how it works. Better go pick some more tomatoes or whatever. I've had this idea and I think it could be fun. And I talked about that with Michelle one time and she thought it was a cool idea. But, talking about it with Anne, we were thinking that it actually might create a bigger problem because they might start to associate these forms of media with rewards. And therefore, put them on a kind of pedestal that they otherwise wouldn't be on. So all of that gamification idea itself might be a huge waste of time and actually backfire. And I mean, just thinking about my own childhood growing up, it did backfire because I can't walk into a room where TV's on and not be like, just like glued to it. Is if there's a TV on and people are talking, I'm like, what? What? Sorry, what did you say? Because I'm just like so ensnared by what's going on the TV. But you'll notice that people who grew up in households that had TV on all the time, they don't get so distracted by it. It's fine on the background, and they're just kind of hanging out, able to have conversations, do whatever. And it's just over there doing its thing. I'm watching it, but they're able to be normal around it. And so it seems like my parents, by trying to, you know, over control it and make it a really special thing on Friday nights, actually put it on a kind of pedestal to where, I mean, I've deconstructed that shit 1,000 times, but here I am still captured, still taken in by it and not sure what to do about it. And so I'm realizing that whole gamification approach would probably actually make things worse. And at the end of the day, what do we care about? Well, in the post-class fractured mass, if there's no canon, we do care about having some kind of a canon. And that means people reading probably, I don't know, like Homer and Plato and Virgil and Shakespeare and Pilgrim's Progress and the King James Bible and, having a culture, having a shared culture. But then part of the problem is that there's all these kinds of things in music and in TV and in movies that are also part of a shared culture. And so I do wonder about that as well. Like I lack a lot of the reference points that my peers tend to have, especially when it comes to, I don't know, movies like The Goonies, or the original Star Trek or something like that. It's just like I can't go back and watch that. Now I've tried, and it's just I lack the nostalgia to actually enjoy it. Whereas like when they go back and watch it, it's like they're relishing in like this special connection they have to it from childhood. And so I'm not sure what to do with all of that. So I think that that's probably enough to set the stage so you know kind of where I'm coming from and what kinds of questions I have for you. I've got a bunch of follow-ups, but let's just start with that.
Oh, all of it's tremendous. So first off, your concerns about the word curiosity are extremely valid. Curiosity without it's all again, like an Augustine would say, everything good can be disordered and therefore can be bad. So there's a form of curiosity that's more like drive, that is great, but then there's a curiosity of, oh, it's really just assimilation for titillation. Oh, that titillated me. Oh, that's titillating. And that becomes good things can always generate an idle simulation, a fakeness, a face of. That's not the thing, right? But then, of course, with Augustine, there's also order. So curiosity without intimacy is dead. But then, of course, intimacy without curiosity isn't even intimacy because there's something about intimacy that is fundamentally a certain going deeper. If intimacy doesn't have a certain going deeper, it's not itself. So curiosity actually, in a way, is a word referring to the action of intimacy. And then the question is, what exactly is the action of intimacy? What do we do in intimacy? There's a certain drive to unfold a mystery, to go deeper into an unknown that you can't behold all at once, that changes with time, that's alive and dynamic. I like to think about the differences between the unknowable and the unknown. If I tell you those mountains are unknowable, you go, okay. But if I say those mountains are unknown, oh, it's exciting, right? So intimacy turns things into unknowns that then make you seek them out. I think also the word curiosity now, for me, curiosity has to be tied to awe. It has to be tied to a sense of beauty. Really, you could almost talk about beholding with a hyphen between be and holding, where it's a way of holding
Mm.
a thing with an open hand as you're beholding it, and it's a mode of being, really. It's a kind of be. I think also there's a lot of talk, but obviously Hegel at the beginning of the science of logic famously has being, nothing, become, becoming. There's a funny way in which becoming is at its best as a beholding, because you are beholding a thing that you're becoming with and toward. One might associate with the absolute idea, which I associate with beauty, that Thomas Jockin speaks of so well, and I agree with, is that there's a way in which what I have in mind with the word curiosity is a certain, I do think it is deep, ontological. It is a mode of being, a certain beholding of things. And also,
Oh,
I
it is
think in,
100%.
yeah, I think also in curiosity, Well, there's a letting, there's a annihilation, there's a clearing, there's a letting thing come forth. I think like it is being toward a thing where you let the being come forth to you, obviously, versus you to it, which look at Sheen and Heidegger, et cetera, so forth. So to me, the very problematic, I suppose my knee jerk is against the word interesting. Because people say interesting, and that's what I is like. Oh, that's interesting. Interesting,
That's
such a
true. That's so true. Yeah.
so my knee jerk is when people talk about things as interesting. But then you're correct that there's a way in which the school talks about curiosity, but it's not tied to all. It's not tied to beauty, drive. It's not tied to fire. I think that metaphor is the correct one. That this keeping a fire alive is I don't think you can do curiosity without fire. It is just merely titillation at that point. So all those points are very well taken. And then, of course, the question becomes how indeed does one cultivate curiosity because we have a problem. All right, that's all nice and all, Dan, about drive and all and curiosity changing demand. But haven't we learned, that the system trains your wants, the sociological condition, the environment, the market? Like it's not merely the case that you're always affected by the external environment, right? You can't, habits don't form in a vacuum. You can't just one day wake up and say, you know what, frick, I listened to Dave and Dan talk and they were talking about curiosity and I'm going to just choose to form it out of nowhere, right? You can't do it. That's what we learn in Habitas and, your great work. It's not so simple. Because you're always in a feedback loop with the material condition, with the environment, right? That's why there's not a clean. I talk a lot about intrinsic motivation, but what belonging again gets into is the problem that intrinsic motivation is never separated from the external, right? So it's not intrinsic separated from the external factors, right? So intrinsic is not merely a separated space. It's always already influenced, right? Well, what do we do then? Well, there has to be a place where you are habituated differently. There has to be a place where you are actually trained differently. Well, that sounds like the home, yeah? Because the home can be a decentralized environment. Like there's a lot of talk today about decentralization, right? And the idea, Web3 and et cetera, so forth. It's an entirely different subject. And I have, without getting into this, in my opinion, the debate between centralization and decentralization is actually a very old debate. And it's been swinging back and forth for a very long time. To use an American example, states' rights versus the central, et cetera, so forth. And always what the debate about decentralization gets stuck at, in my opinion, is government power and sovereignty and stuff like that. And typically what ends up happening in this debate is you have periods of great centralization that become tyrannical. There is a movement then toward decentralization that works until somebody in their decentralization does a moral atrocity, slavery, terrorism, or whatever. Then centralization comes back and you just swing back and forth. And the conversation about centralization and decentralization, which always seems new when it arises, is always just going to repeat that logic. It's in the same way that the revolutionary subject that's overly situated in a classical understanding of the proletariat that doesn't exist anymore. So a understanding of decentralization as a revolution that is actually located in political power or, law or stuff like that is actually just another circular revolution that's not going anywhere because we've seen this in most civil wars. American civil wars, you could look at English civil wars, debates on sovereignties, it's not going to really do much. But if instead we're talking about okay, but what about the decentralization of architectures that formulate different habits or different associations that are different environments to change how people think? Well, now we're talking the proper understanding of decentralization as politically and economically consequential. Now we're talking, because we're not talking about simply political power, we're talking about a decentralization of habit formation. Because is not the great problem is that there's a centralized habit former that is the market or the mall or the business that you go to. There is a centralized architecture, if you will, or logic that is habituating in the same way. There's not a decentralization of the logics that people are absorbing or forming habits regarding. Well, that's possible in the home. If you're deliberate, your home can be a decentralized alternative formation of different ways of thinking. And that's where decentralization, as in the decentralization of habituating logics through the homes can actually be, well, a revolution out of the vicious cycle, if you will. But this, of course, is the great irony of the old left. And Daniel Tutt is correct on this, where he emphasizes the family. The old left, then, if the really the place of the potential of habituating different ways of thinking and different wants toward the direction of, say, curiosity and thus a demand for time, energy, and et cetera, so forth. If the possibility of that is in fact in the home and the family, if you just see the family and the home as a repetition of capitalist logic, which of course it can be, and thus irredeemable or something like that, well, then actually the very place where you can begin tilling the soil or creating the new conditions of different ways of thinking, you're foregoing for a revolution as an overcoming, which even if you won the revolution, you don't have the mode of thinking by which to change what comes next, right? This is the problem. If you still have the same habits and modes of thinking, even if you win the revolution, it will simply be a repetition of the same because the subjectivity has not changed, right? And so really thinking the house, really thinking the home and saying, how do I design this to create different habits, to create different modes of thinking, to not, so as an example I've made 1,000 times, something very important for us with the kids, and then you've asked a tremendous question on media, screen time, gamification, et cetera, so forth, which I think is profound and very important. Like, so for example, we never want our children to associate education, and we've talked about this before, with answering trivia questions, right? Because if you think an educated person is someone who can answer random questions that random people ask about random things, then education, it doesn't even occur to you that being educated is the ability to follow a through line, right? So you want to make sure your home is a place where the mom and dad are not talking to each other with random trivia questions that are just asking, oh, now this, now this. You want to make sure you're not, and then you want to make sure when they're doing their lessons that you have it lead in a direction of pursuing a through line. Like everything they're learning is in the context of through lines, more so than questions that have wrong answers or right answers. Now, of course, reality is a place where there are right and wrong answers when, say, designing an engine. So we're not saying that there are no 2 + 2 = what questions, but the 2 + 2 = questions, you are very careful to contain those in its proper bounds in a sort of Kantian way. Make sure that you say, hey, this is for dealing with technical problems, but guess what? Technical problems is a small slice of the sum of the conditions that humans find themselves in. So you're making sure they know that. The main thing you want to do also is to model and to really encourage, we talked about it when you were here, the deepening of subjects versus the changing of subjects, where because most people in a conversation just constantly change the subject because they don't have the ability to deepen the subject, right? This is something that you can habituate and show in the home that then they can bring outside the home, so they have a resistance to, they have a membrane against the training that the system would do on them to make them a consumer like everyone else. And if you don't do this in the home, well, then where are they going to get that alternative training? So they're just going to be habituated to the logic of capital, to the logic of stimulating, having their demands stimulated versus creating their demands, right? Absolutely for us, and I know we've talked about it before, the main reason we homeschool was to make sure that intrinsic motivation was maintained, to make sure that they associated learning not with trivia, but following a through line. And because it was extremely clear to us that the danger of school as a medium was that it created subconscious associations of what it meant to be educated that we believe was the complete opposite of what it meant to be educated in a manner that would certainly extend humanity and possibly lead in the direction of Scole, et cetera, so forth. Because again, if you're given Scole, but you're not able to follow a through line or you're not able to engage in all, then it will just be boredom or will be dead to you. And then you'll, go back to work, if you will, right? And then, of course, that naturally leads to a certain, if you are trained into following through lines, that naturally leads to a certain cherishing of time to pursue through lines, a cherishing of time energy, of not associating life being about your career or work, because you pointed at this earlier, and this is a major problem, is that people think the thing that you are supposed to do is your career, more of that. Your free time is, well, in the same way that like Nietzsche talks about how we define good as simply the opposite of evil, people are now basically defining leisure as when you're not at work, the opposite of work, right? But there's
Right.
no intentional valuation as Nietzsche was concerned, right? There's no intentional, like, actually, well, yeah, people aren't trained into the habit of thinking a value of their own there, into a through line and a curiosity, right? So all then leisure can be is the opposite of work. And the same that the good is the opposite of evil. It can't have a deeper essence there that people can tap into. And so if you're making sure the architecture of your home is avoiding the subconscious associations that would contribute to the probability that they associate leisure with simply the opposite of work, which it is not, it is more than that, well, then that can go a long way, right? And then all of that then has to be kept in mind with the question of how indeed to deal with the screen, right? Gamification, screen time, Friday night, what is the way by which one goes about it, right? Because ultimately, the question is what exactly would even the heuristic be of the decision, right? So the first you can say, well, we don't want them on it too much. Why? What do you mean by that? What is too much, right? Is it necessarily good to be on it, say, 15 minutes versus 30? Why? Who said, right? What is your standard, right? You get into all of these different questions, right? Well,
Right.
part of it is the idea of, okay, because the screen is basically isomorphic or a small version of what the entire economy does. It trains you into wanting things, right? It's working on you to turn you into a particular kind of subject who is stimulated, whose demand is stimulated versus created, right? So you're aware that the issue with the screen is that it is actually creating habits to make you think in a certain way, right? But of course, it doesn't necessarily have to do that, nor does the TV necessarily have to do that, even if it is likely to do that. I don't think it's 50-50. I think it's 70-30. It can be done, but you have to design it and think about it, right? And it becomes very tricky. Um, there are things as well on where if you make Friday a special thing because there's a certain limitation, we only do it on Friday, it creates a certain depth because there's scarcity, right? So it creates more of a feeling of value. But then, of course, here's the problem. The value then gets transferred into a subconscious association that whenever you see it, it's then valuable and it's hard not to observe it because it attracts you almost like beauty or something, right? So the pedestal, the issue is that if you make the Friday gathering, you have to ask those special events that you have, what is the thing that it's orbiting? Because here's another way to look at it. Those Friday, not that I'm putting words in your mouth, the description of the Friday that you put forth kind of makes it a ritual. And rituals then tend to organize an association of a certain holiness or a certain sacredness. And you want to ask yourself, when the family creates a ritual or something that feels special, be very, very conscious of what is at the center of that activity, because that will create a permanent association then of in the future. So, for example, if there's a few things that I've done, and forgive me if this is, these are just different ideas and different things. One of the things that we think about a lot is I've tried to be intentional about making going to the gas station something very special if you get to pick a candy out, because we don't do that very often, right? So if you go, it's like a freaking holiday, right? Oh my goodness, we are going to go and get to pick something up at the gas station down the road. It's better than Disneyland because it's like a special thing and we don't do it very much. And it's a result of, and there's a certain intimacy in there, something because we're going to get in the car and we're going to go and we're going to pick something out. And what ends up happening is that becomes a powerful association, right? And it becomes something nostalgic that is a certain going with dad, getting in the car and going somewhere. And it's a certain special thing. The other thing is like we have done one of the things that become a sort of fun because vacations, to go to some beach somewhere can be $1 zillion and often it rains. And often those things are actually not necessarily as fun and they tend to be touristy. But you know what you make something special? Staying in a hotel with a pool and having breakfast the next day. It's Disneyland, baby. It's incredible, right? And so these kind of special things that are around special times of year of hotel, that is something that's not necessarily involving the screen, because then even if,
You
please,
to clarify, you also, when you were first telling me about this, you made sure to say we don't take them to Disneyland, because if we take them to
yes,
Disneyland, all of a sudden the hotel is going to be boring.
this is
So
very
no, we
important.
yeah.
Very important. Like you have to have a scaling. You have to have a movement. Like people, if you do it too soon, then it's all dead. That becomes the thing that they're habituated to, the Disneyland, and then everything loses its magic, right? So being aware. So another thing that I would say is I would not. So I personally would not advise making this kind of sacred special event center around a screen, right? Because that does run the risk of reifying it, right? Of making it limited. But what I would say is I'm quite taken by your idea of gamification. It may be able to work in a positive way if it isn't creating a ritual effect. Because I think there's a difference between that, right? Like if it's a scarcity that then leads to a certain kind of, it's connected also with a certain ritual of the family and a certain special time. There's also a difference between limiting some and limiting it too much, and limiting it in a way that creates a kind of deep association, and limiting it in a way that actually then, like you're saying, outsources to the system and the parent doesn't have to constantly say yes or no. Right now, another way you can outsource it is what some parents will do with screen time is they'll say, well, it's the time is 2 and 4. So if it's not 2 to 4, don't ask me. Right. And 2 to 4, what you can watch and do is going to be based on what we've said, what we know. And then also, if they're interested in robotics or something, then those tend to get tied together because the thing they want to watch is teaching them about robotics. Right. These things all kind of get folded into one another. Right. Certainly, I will say creating some sort of structure where the decision of the screen or not is in the structure, not in the arbitrary decision of the parent, is extremely important. Because if you don't do that, you're going to be perpetually negotiated with, and that's quite exhausting. And then you can't win. There's just a perpetual negotiation going on, right? So structure reduces negotiation, but then you want to be aware of the structure you create so that it doesn't overly reify the thing to make it a kind of sacredness that then draws them in too much, right? And actually, what's funny is you have to somehow have a design, and Cadell will talk about it, and other people will talk about this, where there's a certain saturation where you simply get bored with it and you want to do something else, right? An advantage of letting kids just do it as much as they want is there's a natural boredom that sets in, right? Where they just don't want to do it anymore. So they exhaust themselves out of it and naturally move on, right? I will say this. I think that may also, though, be very much tied to the specific game. So me
Yeah,
personally,
yeah.
I really liked growing up. So, we didn't have like a strict screen time, but also I'm growing up when games naturally ended. Like they had stories, they had arcs, they cost money. You'd have to literally go to the store. So there was a geography that naturally limited it. So I liked like RPGs, like Final Fantasy or something, right? Well, they have a story. It might be 60 hours, but you finish it and it's over. Also, it felt like art, right? It literally did just feel like a profound experience. I remember it's very interesting. I remember when Halo first came out, and there were buds at high school that had Halo, and especially when it was online, because I did like GoldenEye, but who didn't like GoldenEye on the N60? If you had access to it, it was pretty great with the brothers. And Perfect Dark was amazing. But what ended up happening was interesting is once you got this online world, I really did not. It was infinite then. There was a certain infinity that went on. That's a very different matter. And the problem is,
Yeah, this was no longer the guys getting together with their Xboxes in a LAN to play in a house, which I never really got to do, but maybe twice in my life I was present for such things. Yeah. But you had everybody bring their consoles and connect them by LAN.
land. Yep.
And yeah, that requires actual organizing. That requires people doing all kind of wiring in the meat space. But as soon as it becomes the internet, it's just like takes all of that embodiment and that wiring out of it. Now it's just like all offloaded onto some platform, and it literally just the whole model of gaming became how long can we keep the kids playing?
Yes. We are very strict in regard to, I think this gets into the specifics of the game. I am quite strict personally on games that have an infinity loop. as I guess I would say. Like these internet games that are just kind of infinite, where you just play and you go on forever. I definitely think about games that have story. I think about games that have, character development, that have a natural endpoint in them. Or they have a certain creativity, like you're creating a space, like a Mario Maker game where you're making a thing,
Minecraft.
right? Like, where there's a construction that's going on, right? I am not a fan at all at, well, something like a World of Warcraft, these kind of massive endless games. That that is not the same because there's no possibility of a saturation point. And also, they don't, in my opinion, the likelihood of inspiration is very low. So, for example, if I played Ocarina of Time on the N64, I would then afterwards find myself taking a walk for a long time, thinking of my own story, and it led into the Sword of Tribulation and writing that seven. There was a kind of tunnel, if you will, like it led into an inspiration that led to a creativity, right? And this is what I really want to emphasize. You need to make sure that whatever, because we don't believe in doing no screen. We think that's not the way. But we also are aware that the details of the screen are important. You're looking to create a kind of channel between screen, inspiration, doing something, where the screen is inspiring something, really. Like you're then designing something out of it. Like you're using the screen to inspire action. Like for me, Final Fantasy and games and Chrono Trigger on the RPG, on the Super Nintendo was pretty great. That was inspiring writing fiction or writing stories, right? So it is leading out of itself. And actually, you eventually get that also naturally creates a certain point where you don't want to play the game because you want to work on the novel or you want to take a walk and think about things, right? And so that sort of, you're trying to create, I want to say, a loop between the digital and the real, where it is using in a certain inspirational way. And that for me is very important. And so I guess what I would say with the gamification point that you're raising, what would have to occur, because there is the risk of the gamification of creating a certain raising it up on a pedestal, et cetera, so forth. But if the gamification occurred and the games that we're playing also were inspirational, that led them to doing things outside of the game that would naturally create saturations and just moving beyond the game, then you're having a system that may be able to avoid the pedestal because you're using the game to almost in a sense go through it or to think of doing something beyond it, right? And that kind of channel, that kind of directionality, like the media is for inspiration. The media is for thinking of something for you to create your own demand. You are consuming to be inspired. You are consuming to think. That's the structure that I think occurs and needs to occur. I will also say there are also other things you can perhaps do, like, so for example, with video games, I think also there's a problem where this may sound odd, where the graphics of new games are actually too good, so there's less imagination. When you were playing Final Fantasy VI, the graphics were only so good on the Super Nintendo, so you had to imagine Terra and Seal. You had to imagine the airships, right? And you went in the woods and you imagined them. Now the graphics are so good that you have less imagination, so it's more of a cold medium than a hot, I suppose, as McLuhan would say, because it does a lot of the work for you, right? So another factor of this is actually the literal quality of the graphics of the game are a part of the problem as well, right? And so for me, there's also a big difference between, like, because I still had Link's Awakening on literally, I still have the block Game Boy, right? So I give that to Heaven. It's like, hey, here's Legend of Zelda Link. And the graphics then, they're naturally then going and drawing pictures to see what the windfish looks like. They're naturally then trying to draw different things because let me put it this way. The more you can think about especially when children are young, um, give them less, make sure the things are of graphics that are not so good, right? So that they are able, because literally just graphics, the quality of the image can move it toward being more cold than hot thus less imagination, thus less involvement, thus reducing the probability of inspiration. And don't introduce good graphics, if you will, until later on when they've already developed the habits of imagining for themselves. And then think about that also with movies and like in shows and different, like another problem. Like it is very clear that many of the cartoons today are basically dopamine, very quick splits in the screen, very fast in the cartoon strike. Like it's really, the cartoon is designed to make you not think. Just go on to the next, go on to the next. Okay, well, what about just showing them the 1980s Transformer movies or the show, right? With the graphics, it was slower pace. There's a slower movement. You can do this, right? So for me, like that's also a part of the conversation that I think many parents are missing. They just can't imagine giving their kid Kirby's Dream Land on the original Game Boy from 1994. We have to give them a PS5 or nothing, right? No, ladies and gentlemen, you can actually introduce lower things that actually naturally, then you say, yeah, you've got the screen. You can do the screen. Here you go. That actually also makes it easier to move into imagination in different things. You can do these things. And then, of course, basically also a part of it, I guess, for us too, is, Haven loves technology, loves computers. He's very interested in VR and different things. And if they say, well, I really want a VR headset, then you also say, okay, well, then let me give you jobs. You can help me unfold chairs at Mead Lake. You do create certain barriers where they have to earn it. You don't necessarily say no, but you also make it clear that you would have to pay for it. You would have to do these things. Oh, and if you did it, there would be a certain screen time, right? There would be a certain limitation to it. But also, it's very different from a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old asking those questions in a 4-year-old. So there's a perpetual judgment of the mean. I'm happy to go into detail on any of those different things, but I think the questions that you're asking are very, very good and very important and very profound.
Yeah, well, that gives me a lot to think about. And for right now, I guess, well, before I go, I want to say this has been an amazing or lovely conversation. I know Anne's going to be really excited to listen to it, and Michelle will be as well. It'd be fun to do some kind of a follow up with the ladies in our lives. And the it does, yeah, I guess it feels like a sort of Pandora's box problem.
Mhm.
Uh, you can't go into town without kids seeing higher resolution images, and that these images are so potent, and it's like, okay, but how to make it so that there's just going to be a lot more reading. At the end of the day, I think that's the main goal. And so you got me turned on to Postman's teaching as a conserving activity. Now, I think Rue has also had a big role to play there. I knew him for Technopoly and amusing ourselves to death, but I didn't realize he'd done all these books on education. And one of the things that's great about Postman is that, so in teaching as a conserving activity, he's talking about the school as a medium, which is to say it's an environment. It structures life, it structures consciousness, it structures tendencies. And he talks about how in a time of extreme ossification and stasis, uh, the school can be a lot more of a place of change. But in a society that is constant change, the school needs to be the counter to all of that. The school needs to be a place. So, for instance, if television and video games are already what's happening outside of school, well, then the school can't just become a mirror of that reality where it's just a bunch of disparate threads that don't really connect. And so he's very sympathetic to the back to basics approach to education, though he's also critical of what those basics often are with these more traditional approaches to school. And so, first of all, folks, if you're going to turn all of this information into some kind of action and do something with it, I highly recommend going and checking out Teaching as a Conserving Activity. That's an awesome book, regardless of whether you're all about having kids or not, or whether you're about them being homeschooled or going to some other kind of school, this is an important book for anybody who cares about teaching, about learning. But bringing it back to that, I kind of wanted to touch on the fact that it's not like there's a global village outside of the school where everybody watches the same TV shows or movies anymore. Like, with my classes and students, it's like, 3 out of 10 or, a 4 or 5 out of 25. It's kind of random. You never know, but it's always going to be a minority will have seen any given show that I talk about. So whether it's Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad or something, it's not a lot have seen it. You can't really bank on a lot of people having seen it. Napoleon Dynamite. I referenced. I like to reference Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite because he's the character who's stuck in high school even though he's in his 40s. He just wishes that he was back in high school playing football. And it's a really funny thing. Every time it comes back to Uncle Rico, it's a great thread in that movie. And the moment you start to use it, people instantly get the reference and they go, "Oh yeah," and it's a great example if they've seen it. But if they haven't seen it, it's just like, oh, well, then I would have to explain all of that, or I'll just have to kind of gloss over and I lose that person, right? Well, there was a time when everybody had seen Napoleon Dynamite or Anchorman or something like that. And now you can't bank on that. And in fact, you can't bank on everybody having seen anything. And so there is a literary canon that it seems to me like the school is responsible for a literary canon, but it's also a big question for me then. Well, might there be a sort of civics? I don't want to call it civics. We could even call it pop culture kind of responsibility now put on schools or families where it's like, yes, in order to have your kid be an American, there's going to be a certain set of things that you should probably introduce them to at some point, like Jurassic Park and Star Wars. Like, come on, there's just these basic things that you've got to actually see. Pixar, and I think a lot of people who are doing homeschool as a deliberate kind of activity, or people who are going to like a more elite sort of charter school that's trying to bend the bow back in some direction, a lot of them would probably be put off by the idea of treating pop culture references like those ones in some kind of a dignified way. And so, like, oh, though this is important, we should actually do this. And so I definitely want to hear what you would tell those people. I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are in general. I do I know we talked about time limits or whatever, and I totally forgot that my car is in like a load zone downstairs. And it has a note on the dashboard that says that I'll be done by 8 p.m. and that was 43 minutes ago. So hopefully they don't tow me or put a boot on the car or give me a ticket. I feel like I should probably cut off sometime in the near future. Otherwise I would just go all night. But before I do though, I definitely want your thoughts on like, yeah, what would be the institution uh where that kind of stuff should be playing. And one of the things that I was thinking about, and maybe just a way of doing this is like a space on the property, like if it's in a shop, if it's in my mom's shop, if it's just a random place around the farm, where there's just like a television and it has, let's just say a thumb drive in the back of it with, you know, 600 files, and they're just on shuffle. Or maybe it's only 50 files and they're on shuffle. And like out of those, what would those be? Some of them could be like our own programmed reminders of the things that we value and cherish and want to be reminded of. It could have our own edited programming, but then also like mixed with the sound of music. Star Wars: A New Hope. Yesterday was Star Wars Day. May the fourth be with you. And so, I fell asleep to watching A New Hope last night. I'm American, okay? But what does that even mean anymore? And I think it's up to us, in a sort of sense, to 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 have that conversation. I didn't have the privilege of growing up in a household that was literate in, uh, Shakespeare or Homer or Virgil or Plato, but at least we had the King James Bible, and we did read that every morning. And so I think that's a good start. And I think the last thing I would say is what I want to do is talk to my parents and say, look, you're going to be great grandparents. You're going to do a great job. But also, I don't want them just seeing you guys always vegging out watching cop shows. So I think we should actually, because they deserve to watch cop shows at the end of their hard day's work. I have no problem with that. But, could we put the piano in here and, like maybe we just like make a thing of like, make a thing of singing and playing music together. I'll tell them like in exchange for playing music and singing with us, we'll sing whatever songs you want. Christian hymns, I don't care. We'll do it. Let's do it. Come on, let's start a family band and make it so that the kids their best memories aren't movies. Their best memories are the actual the participation and creation of music itself. I think that might be part of the solution. I get excited by the prospect of it because I've always wanted to play music, and I think there's nothing more powerful than the love of parents or the love of children or the love of grandparents, and I think being deliberate before we are in that context, setting up for it and being like, yeah, let's play music more. I think that might be part of it, and then just like leaving stuff playing on a TV where it's just like, yeah, you just grew up where these certain cultural touchstones, these sort of references, they just play all the time. It's just you just grew up around it. We didn't always queue it up and have a big family night. Ooh, we're gonna watch the movie. No, you just grew up around it. It's just part of your life. It's like, yeah, it's over there. It's playing. Yeah, whatever. We don't limit time to it. It's just it is what it is. Like that's an idea right now. But I'm definitely curious to hear your thoughts. I'm also curious to hear everyone else's thoughts on this because this is, to me, kind of like uncharted territory. Okay, thanks. This has been awesome.
This has been awesome. I don't want you to get towed, but you're asking such freaking important questions. So I'm gonna try to keep you from getting towed up. So you also said something very important about kids will be exposed to better graphic things. Exactly, they will. There's a few things. So first, if you as the dad give them Legend of Zelda's Link Awakening, we're then gonna have a game of pretending we're Zelda going to the mailbox fighting the characters. So you connect the graphic game with something dad's doing, and also you enjoy the game and actually like you're actually connecting it with something. And then two, it's not that you say there are no good graphic because they're inevitably going to experience it. What you're doing is showing that the games that have less graphics are not therefore worse than the ones with better, because actually they open imagination. It's easier to have games with them because dad knows them and he can play with them, and so there are trade-offs with both. That's what you're trying to do. Because naturally the kid associates bad graphics, bad game, right? What you're trying to show is no, there are trade-offs, and all of them has benefits in different ways, and that's how you start hedging. That you just change things. Also, too critically, I'm not saying that good graphics are necessarily bad. It's just a factor in the decision, right? The main thing you want to watch out for are infinity games. There's the car, finite, and infinite games. Literally infinite games. Infinite games are the threat. And actually, ironically, infinite games destroy cultural connection too, because people just stay on one game. They're not diverse, right? So the infinite game can be as destructive to a shared cultural, heritage as can being censored or repressed or not allowed to participate in it at all, right? And I think a lot of people actually, because they've gotten trapped in an infinity game, are not developing cultural resources or association in the same way that people are denied. There's a way in which people actually, by falling into infinity games, are losing a culture on which to draw on in ways similar to people that aren't allowed to participate at all, right? So the name of the game is to maintain the cultural artifacts, movies, films, shows, etc., so forth, games that allow robust association, things to draw on, treasure trove of images, as Roger, Scruton would say, that is based primarily on finite things, finite games versus infinite games that I'll just keep using from Carr. I will also note that there is a difference between the drawing on associations or symbols from movies. A lot of times people do that to make a joke or to laugh or to say something funny. But there's a difference between doing that for that sake and doing it to maintain a through line. And actually, the critical thing that you're doing, that actually what you really want to be able to do is to draw on movies and books and things you've shown to maintain a through line versus contribute to the now this conversation, titillation conversation, right? So what you want to do is ask yourself, in my opinion, as the parent, what are the movies, shows, books that increases the probability that are good for through lines and to maintain through lines, right? Like I think about myself, like also too, there's another weird that there's so much and I don't want you to tow your car.
No, it's okay.
There's
I don't. I think
I
we'll be
don't
all
need the
right.
car. I don't need the car. So it's just like, but there's also ironically actually an underappreciation of the screen that can occur, or an underappreciation of media. Because there's like, oh, we don't want the kids on it all the time. There could be different problems and different things. Well, my goodness, because of the screen, it is possible for them to see a Terrence Malick film like Tree of Life, which I do like, or, to actually encounter some of these great films like Lawrence of Arabia that are utterly captivating, or to experience, well, I can just go on. There are particular films and movies that my life would be a whole lot worse without of it. And goodness, the screen is an incredible thing to make it possible for us to have these experiences of these things. So, first off, a lot of times the parent sees their role, in my opinion, the parent sees their role as to monitor the screen, to make sure that bad things don't come in or it's not overused. So you're automatically framing the screen as a bad thing. You're just starting off where it's a problem, right? Well, no, you want to curate the screen. You're trying to curate it like a museum, like an art gallery. You're trying to make it something that actually is going to be experienced by the children in a manner that increases the probability of their ability to maintain through lines in conversation, inspiration, creation, and so on and so forth, right? I want them to see Lawrence of Arabia. I want them to see Christopher Nolan films there. I want them to see certain things, and I can go on and so forth. Because I know without these things, they will be lesser for it, right? When Shakespeare was written, he was considered basically the popular. He was not like Shakespeare now is Shakespeare, but at the time, he wasn't necessarily Shakespeare, right? It was actually could have been seen just popular or whatever, right? Um, I think also there's a question of how does the parent curate the screen? Not just view it as a problem, which of course is a very difficult thing because the screen kind of resists being curated. It wants to just be a stimulation for consumer goods. So you're curating something dangerous. But if you curate this dangerous thing well, it can be very powerful in positive ways. So to think about curating the screen, curating technology, designing technology, I think for me is very, very important. It is, and that's going to start moving in, I think, positive directions. There's more to be said. This is an extremely important discussion. I will stop there and say that I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I appreciate your time. I hope your car is there, and I look forward to speaking more in the future, Dave. Thank you so much.
Daniel, it's been an absolute delight as always. And yeah, let's do it sooner rather than later. All right.
Yes, sir. All the best. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. All the best.